Section 10 of Oliver Cromwell by Samuel Rawson Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tombooker. Chapter 5. The Nominated Parliament and the Protectorate, Part 1. As at the trial of the king, so in the ejection of Parliament, Cromwell had been thrown back on the employment of military force. Legality was clearly against him on both occasions. Yet it must not be forgotten that he was the last to concur in the employment of force, and that there was much to be said for his assertion that the sitting members were no Parliament. Reduced by the flight of Royalists to the king in 1642 and by Pride's purge in 1648, they had, after an existence of 12 years and a half, little remaining to them of that representative character which is the very being of a parliament. At all events, this time at least, Cromwell was secure of popular favor. Not a single voice was raised in defense of the expelled members. In the evening, some wag scrawled on the door of the Parliament House, quote, "This house to be let unfurnished." Close quote. The Parliament disappeared amidst general derision. For all that, the work before Cromwell was one of enormous, perhaps even of hopeless, difficulty. Without Parliament or king, the nation was thrown upon its own resources to reconstruct its institutions as best it might. It was inevitable that in such stress of storm it should hark back to the old paths, and should see no prospect of settled government save in the restoration of the throne, or at least in the election of another parliament. Yet this was the very thing that Cromwell and all who were associated with him most dreaded. It was but too probable that such a solution would sweep away not only Puritanism, but all hope of political reform. Everything for which the army had fought and for which the nation had suffered was at stake, and it was not in human nature, certainly not in Cromwell's nature, to make such a sacrifice without a struggle. That such a struggle could only be prolonged with the support of the army was self-evident. Cromwell, however, was the last of men to desire to establish a purely military government, and the army, to do it justice, was commanded by men who were, for the most part, desirous to support their general in the experiment of establishing a civil government which would have dispensed with the interference of military power. The tragedy, the glorious tragedy, of Cromwell's subsequent career lay in the impossibility of permanently checking the instincts of military politicians to intervene in favor of those guarantees regarded by them as indispensable for the maintenance of the cause which they had so long upheld with all their might. Distrust of the constituencies was the prominent feature of Cromwell's next move. The compromise offered by him of the temporary establishment of a non-elective body to prepare a basis of settlement whilst parliamentary institutions remained in abeyance was now adopted by the officers. Lambert, who advocated a scheme for establishing a Council of State, apparently with provision for the increased independence of the executive, together with the election of a parliament with restricted functions, was unable to enforce his views. A small council of state was established to carry on current affairs, but it was in the council of officers that the main question of the Constitution was to be determined. Cromwell, after some hesitation, rallied to a very different scheme which had been suggested by Harrison, the brilliant soldier who dreaded to see the government in the hands of any but the saints. Cromwell, however, whilst accepting Harrison's views on the whole, determined to modify them in order to make the new assembly something more than a group of pious fanatics. He was consequently now anxious that it should include notable personages. Even Fairfax was suggested, who had contended against the king, but who had no connection with the extreme sections of the community which found favor in Harrison's eyes. It was eventually resolved that the Council of Officers should invite nominations from the congregational churches in each county, reserving to itself the power of rejecting persons so named, and also of adding names which found no place on the list. On June 8, the persons finally selected received writs issued in the name of Cromwell as Lord General. An attempt had been made to secure the inclusion not only of Fairfax but of Vane, but neither of them would accept a place in the new assembly. On July 4, the nominees of the army took their seats at Westminster. Cromwell, at all events, threw himself entirely into the spirit of the occasion. In a long speech, he manifested his delight at seeing the government at last entrusted to the hands of the godly. No such authority, he proclaimed triumphantly, had ever before been entrusted to men on the ground that they owned God and were owned by him. For once, the emotional side of his nature had gained the upper hand over his practical common sense. In long detail he told of the misconduct of the late Parliament, and repelled the idea that he had had any intention of substituting his own authority for that of the discarded House. It had been incumbent on him and his colleagues, quote, not to grasp at the power ourselves, or to keep it in military hands, no, not for a day, but as far as God enabled us with strength and ability to put it into the hands of proper persons that might be called from the several parts of the nation. Close quote. Quote, this necessity, he proceeded to aver, and I hope we may say for ourselves, this integrity of concluding to divest the sword of all power in the civil administrations, hath been that hath moved us to put you to this trouble. Close quote. Then, enlarging on the providential character of the mission of the members of the new assembly, he urged them with many scriptural quotations to take up their authority as men whom God had placed as rulers of the land. What, then, was to be said of that ideal of elected parliaments, which had sunk so deeply into the minds of that generation? Quote, if it were a time, he suggested, to compare your standing with those that have been called by the suffrages of the people, which who can tell how soon God may fit the people for such a thing? None can desire it more than I. Would all were the Lord's people, as it was said, would all the Lord's people were prophets. I would all were fit to be called. Close quote. In time, indeed, this might be possible, when the good and religious conduct of this assembly had won the people to the love of godliness. Quote, is not this the likeliest way to bring them to their liberties? Close quote. Finally, after much enforcement of the encouragements held forth by the prophets and the psalmists, he resigned all the power provisionally exercised by himself into the hands of his hearers, announcing to them that their power also was to be provisional. They were to hold it only till November 3, 1654, and then to give place to a second assembly to be elected by themselves, an assembly which was to sit for no more than a year, in which time it was to make provision for the future government of the country. Contrary, as it would seem, to the intention of those by whom it had been called, the new assembly audaciously assumed the name of Parliament, its real position being that of a mere body of nominees. Lilburne was once more brought into the field. In 1649, Lilburne had been tried and acquitted, but had subsequently been banished by the Long Parliament, which had added to its sentence a declaration that he would be guilty of felony if he, at any time, returned to England. He now reappeared in London, where he was sent to prison, again tried, and again acquitted. The line taken by him and his followers was that the so-called Parliament now in existence was no Parliament at all, as it was not elected by the people. With Cromwell's full consent, Lilburne was retained in confinement, being ultimately removed to Jersey, where no writ of habeas corpus could deliver him. For a time, Lilburne's attack consolidated the alliance between the Lord General and the nominees to whom political power had been entrusted. Yet it was not long before Cromwell's practical sense took alarm at their proceedings. It was indeed not the case, as has often been said, that the majority of the members were mere enthusiasts, but the enthusiasts settled down to parliamentary work, seldom absenting themselves from the House, and being always ready to vote when a division was called, whilst those who distrusted them could not always be brought to a due sense of the importance of their parliamentary duties, and were apt to be led away by interest or pleasure from supporting their opinions by their votes. Two questions were soon found to divide the parties: that of law reform, more especially the reform of Chancery, and that of a religious organization other than compulsory uniformity under bishops or presbyters. On both these questions Cromwell was intensely interested, and there can be little doubt that if the nominated Parliament had conducted itself with due regard for practical exigencies, it would have retained his good will to the end. Unfortunately, this was not the case. It proposed a total abolition of the Court of Chancery, thus handing over to the hostile judges of the common law that system of equity which had been growing up with beneficial results for generations, whilst it also took in hand with a light heart the codification of the law, though not a single practicing lawyer had a seat in the House, in the hope that, quote, the great volumes of law would come to be reduced into the bigness of a pocket-book. Close quote. No wonder that Cromwell dropped into a friend's ear the words, quote, I am more troubled now with the fool than with the knave. Close quote. No wonder either that in September he drew aside from Harrison, under whose influence he had decided in favor of summoning the nominees, and that he listened with greater respect to Lambert, the military representative of constitutionalism, and the determined opponent of political fanaticism. Cromwell's position was rendered difficult by his association with this ill-starred assembly. On September 14, a broadside was scattered in the streets charging him with treason to, quote, "his lords the people of England," close quote. Not because he had broken up the miserable remnant of the Long Parliament, but because he had stood in the way of the election of a new House. And it is highly probable that a large number of people who had nothing to do with the distribution of broadsides shared in this opinion. Still greater was the danger of an appeal to the army, with which the writers concluded. It was known that many of the soldiers, and even of the officers, were restive under the suspension of popular elections, and it was found necessary to secure submission by cashiering Lieutenant Colonel Joyce, who had formerly, as a cornet, carried off the king from Holmby House, and who now threw himself on the side of those who cried out for constitutional rights. On the subject of church organization, Parliament was as subversive as on the subject of law reform. Many of its members held with the Fifth Monarchy preachers that the government of the state ought to be exclusively in the hands of the saints, and, not unnaturally, concluded that they were themselves the saints, thus taking a broad issue in defiance of the theory that the government ought to be administered or controlled by the elected representatives of the nation. The immediate dispute, however, turned on the unwillingness of the advance party to continue any sort of endowment of the clergy. Cromwell, it is true, on more than one occasion had expressed himself strongly against the existing tithe system, and would have been perfectly ready to concur in any plan for the removal of its abuses, or for substituting for it, as had been suggested in the Agreement of the People, presented by the army, a more equitable mode of raising the money needed by the clergy. Further than that he was not likely to go, and matters were brought to a crisis by a resolution passed on November 17 for the abolition of patronage, and still more by the decision of the House on December 10, though only by a majority of 2, to reject the scheme of church government founded in the main on the lines drawn by Owen, in which the payment of tithes was taken as a financial basis. Some time before the last vote was taken, the principal officers, under Lambert's leadership, had under consideration a plan of a written constitution in which the executive power was to be strengthened and conferred upon Cromwell with the title of king, whilst the legislative power was to be conferred on an elected assembly, thus embodying the ideas which had been enunciated by Cromwell in his conference with the lawyers and politicians at the end of 1651. When this constitution was complete, it was shown to Cromwell, who objected to the royal title, and who seems also to have been unwilling to have anything to do with another violent dissolution. On December 10, when the vote on church organization was taken, Lambert and his allies found their opportunity. It is probable that they promised Cromwell that the House should be dissolved by its own action, and that, on receiving this assurance, he preferred not to be informed of the course by which this desirable end was to be attained. The course, indeed, was simple enough. The conservative reformers, if they chose to attend in anything like their full strength, were in a majority, and on the 12th they got up early and flocked to the House, where, before their bewildered opponents could rally in force, they immediately voted that Parliament should resign its powers into the hands of the Lord General. Then, starting for Whitehall in procession, with the Speaker at their head, they announced to Cromwell the decision they had taken. Their advanced colleagues kept their seats, but upon attempting to remonstrate were expelled by a body of soldiers. As in the absence of the Speaker they could not technically be considered to be a House, those who interfered were able to aver, without literary untruthfulness, that there had been no forcible dissolution of Parliament. In a very short time Cromwell had agreed with the officers on the Constitution to be adopted under the name of the Instrument of Government. The executive power was to reside in a Lord Protector and Council, the members of which were to be appointed for life, Cromwell being named as the first Protector. The legislative power was assigned without restriction to a Parliament elected by constituencies formed, so far as the counties were concerned, upon a new franchise, the franchise in the boroughs being left in its old anomalous condition. This latter concession to prejudice was, however, of less importance, as a sweeping redistribution of seats, copied with little alteration from the scheme put forward in the Agreement of the People, largely increased the number of the county members and disfranchised in equally large numbers the smaller boroughs which had fallen under the influence of the country gentlemen. The Parliament thus constituted was to meet once in 3 years and to sit at least for 5 months. Any bill passed by this body was to be suspended for 20 days to give an opportunity for the Protector to explain objections he might entertain to it. If Parliament refused to listen to his objections, the bill became law in spite of him, provided that it contained nothing contrary to the instrument itself. The negative voice about which so much had been heard in the last years of Charles I was, therefore, not assigned to the Protector. For all that, the control over the executive is of greater importance to the development of representative institutions than legislative independence, and in this respect the hold of Parliament over the executive was of the flimsiest description, consisting merely of the right to propose 6 names whenever there was a vacancy in the Council, out of which the Council would select 2, and the Protector again make his choice between the 2. Even the financial arrangements, through which parliaments usually make their way to power, were settled in such a way as to debar the elected House from obtaining even indirect control. It is true that the instrument started with the sweeping generalization that, quote, "no tax, charge, or imposition," close quote, was to be, quote, "laid upon the people but by common consent in Parliament," close quote. But this statement was followed by a clause assigning to the Protector £200,000 for civil expenses, besides as much as was needed for keeping up the navy, as well as an army of 30,000 men, and this sum, to which no definite limits were placed, was to be raised out of the customs, quote, "and such other ways and means as shall be agreed upon by the Protector and Council," close quote, As to the army and navy thus secured, the Protector was to dispose and order them with the consent of Parliament during its short session, but during all the rest of the 3 years with the consent of the Council only. It would, however, be a mistake to say that the instrument established absolute government in England. The Protector was bound to act under the control of the Council, and though scarcely any record of the political action of that body has been preserved, there is enough to show that whilst Cromwell's personal influence over it was necessarily great, it was by no means a mere tool in his hands. The constitutional control to which the Protector was subjected was therefore a real one, though that control was in the hands of a body meeting in secret, and sufficiently self-centered to make no bid for popularity by the speeches made in the course of discussions amongst its members, as a more popular assembly would have done. Finally, religious liberty was secured for all congregations which did not admit, quote, popery or prelacy, close quote, whilst the right of issuing ordinances with the force of law was granted to the Protector and Council till the first Parliament met. It has frequently been urged that the instrument was the earliest example of that system of fixed constitutions of which the most notable instance is that of the United States, and must therefore rank with such constitutions rather than with the system of parliamentary supremacy which was ultimately adopted in England. The comparison with the American Constitution, however, can only stand with those who are resolved to fix their attention on similarities and to ignore differences. The instrument, it is true, resembles the Constitution of the United States in refusing to submit the holders of executive authority to the constant control of the legislature, and in setting forth the relations between the bodies of the state in a written document. On more important points, there is a worldwide distinction. In America, the whole federal constitution is redolent of popular control. Every 4 years the president is re-elected or replaced, and though Congress cannot dismiss a president except by a judicial impeachment, it has complete control over the finances and can leave him without supply. Add to this the ingrained habit of the American people in giving vent to popular opinion and in pressing it on the notice of the government which it has given to itself, and we shall find little cause to seek in the Constitution of the United States for a justification of the instrument, a document drawn up by soldiers and endowing the chief of the state and his counselors with a lifetime tenure of office, with an abundant armed force, and with a power of taxation adequate to all ordinary requirements in time of peace. The question raised by the instrument was not whether the national control was to be exercised indirectly through Parliament or directly through a popular vote, but whether it should be exercised at all. The constitutional principles alike respected in England and America are diametrically opposed to those on which the government of the Protectorate was founded. On December 16, 1653, Oliver was installed at Westminster as Lord Protector under the conditions of the instrument. His council consisted of 7 officers and 8 civilians, the most notable of the latter being Sir Anthony Ashley Cooper, better known by the title long afterwards conferred on him by Charles II as the Earl of Shaftesbury, who had been an active member of the councils formed after the breakup of the Long Parliament. Little as is known of his actions during this period of his life, his rallying to the Protectorate can only be explained as the result of the conviction that Oliver was in earnest in his intention of giving to the new government a preponderatingly civilian character, and of keeping it out of the hands of fanatics on one hand, and of soldiers on the other. In Thurlow, who had acted as secretary to the council since the spring of 1652, the Protector acquired an official whose ability was beyond dispute, who was appalled by no labors, and one who, with the aid of the network of spies whose poverty he utilized, was keen-sighted in penetrating the secrets of conspirators at home and abroad. The Protectorate was at least placed beyond immediate danger by the adhesion of the army and the fleet. Scarcely less important was the concurrence of the judges, amongst them that honorable man and eminent lawyer Matthew Hale, who had won Oliver's approbation by his services in the cause of law reform. Hale, indeed, informed the Protector that as he was personally desirous of seeing a royalist restoration, he could only remain on the bench on the condition that he should be excused from taking part in the trials of political prisoners. Oliver at once gave the required promise. The compromise was creditable to both the parties concerned. The Protector, by his assumption of the government, had roused up enemies enough to make him chary of dispensing with the support of so valuable a helper. To the Royalists, who hoped to strike at a single person more easily than at a parliament, were added the Fifth Monarchy preachers, who held that Oliver was, quote, "the vile person to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom," close quote, but who should, quote, "come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries," close quote, as foretold by the prophet Daniel. They were the more dangerous as they were known to have supporters in the army, especially as Harrison, who shared their opinions, had been thought of by the advanced members of the nominated Parliament as a possible substitute for Oliver in the command. The first repressive action of the Protectorate was, therefore, to place two of the most turbulent of the preachers under lock and key, and to deprive Harrison of his commission. Such men were only really dangerous by their hold on a portion of the army, whilst the Commonwealth's men, such as Bradshaw and Vane, though not in the least likely to head an armed resistance, were strong in the conviction which they shared with a considerable number of their countrymen, that the only possibility of defense against the evils of military rule was to be found in a recurrence to legality. It is true that with them legality consisted in the restoration of a sovereign parliament, whilst the Royalists saw it in the restoration of the king, but if ever time and circumstances should fuse the two ideas together, a body of opinion would be created which would try to the uttermost the fabric of a government raised on other principles. Oliver's task was necessarily conditioned by the nature of the opposition he had to encounter. His new system, if it were to have a chance of becoming permanent, would have to commend itself to that large majority of men who follow no ideals, but are content to live under any rule, whatever may have been its origin, if only the rulers confer upon them a reasonable amount of protection, and are sufficiently in sympathy with the governed to be regarded with love rather than with fear. It was this quality that had mainly helped Elizabeth to make a doubtful legal position a step in her triumphant career, and it was to Elizabeth alone amongst recent English sovereigns that Oliver looked with respect and admiration. Nor was he deficient in many of the characteristics which had made Elizabeth great. He had the same patriotism, the same skill in the selection of agents, the same impatience of partisan bitterness in church and state, the same readiness to trust in the healing virtues of time. The chief obstacles in the way of a repetition of Elizabeth's success lay not merely in the stain of the king's blood upon his hands, but also in his leadership of an army of which the officers shaped their conduct in accordance with distinct religious and political ideas. He had risen to power by the sympathy of these men. Was it possible to secure the sympathy of the nation without alienating the army, to the support of which he must look till he could place his authority on a wider basis? In the first and easiest portion of the task before the Protector, the redress of grievances weighing upon the people, there was no hesitation. The instrument had conferred upon Oliver and his council the right of issuing ordinances with the force of law up to the meeting of Parliament, and in little more than 8 months no fewer than 82 of these ordinances had been issued, subject to amendment, if Parliament chose to interfere. The council was, in fact, like the cabinet of today, far more capable of initiating legislation than a parliament consisting of several hundred members, and that so little criticism attended these ordinances may be taken as satisfactory evidence that there was good reason for that strengthening of the government which had been the main argument of the founders of the new Constitution. The ordinance for the reform of Chancery was certainly exposed to the conservative objections of the lawyers and was, no doubt, susceptible of improvement, but it aimed at the removal of acknowledged abuses, especially at accelerating the movements of a court whose long delays had caused that widespread irritation which had given support even to the exaggerated proposals of the nominated Parliament. Still more important was the adoption of a new scheme of church government. The minister presented to a living was required to have a certificate of fitness from 3 persons of known godliness and integrity, one of them being a settled minister. Afterwards, he was to hand this certificate to certain commissioners known as triers, and to obtain their testimony that he was, quote, a person for the grace of God in him, his holy and unblameable conversation, as also for his knowledge and utterance, able and fit to preach the gospel. Close quote. Having become an incumbent, he was liable to expulsion by a local body of ejectors for immorality or for holding blasphemous or atheistical opinions. As long as he was maintained in his post, he might uphold any Puritan system he pleased and organize his congregation on the Presbyterian, Independent, or Baptist system, if he could persuade them to follow him. Those persons, whether lay or clerical, who objected to the system upheld in their parish church, were at liberty to form separate congregations, gathered churches, as they were called, at their own discretion. Later on, towards the close of 1655, Oliver's tolerant spirit gave way to the return of the Jews, who had been exiled from England since the reign of Edward I. A few Unitarians were no doubt excluded from the benefits of his toleration. Moreover, the Society of Friends, now rising into importance under the leadership of George Fox, was also threatened with exclusion as presumably guilty of blasphemy, though the Protector himself not infrequently interfered on behalf of its members. Even if this had been otherwise, the Society put in no claim for participation in a legal support, or even for acknowledgment by the state. That the church thus constituted was but a Puritan church is the charge commonly brought against the system of the Protectorate. That it was so is certainly not to be denied, but, after all, it must be remembered that, so far as opposition to Puritanism was based on definite religious grounds, and not merely on moral slackness, it was confined to a comparatively small number of Englishmen. Before the days of Laud, the clergy of the Church had been for the most part, so far as their teaching was concerned, Puritan in their ideas, and lax in their ceremonial observances, and thus the ecclesiastical changes initiated by the Long Parliament had been received by the bulk of the laity rather as the removal of innovations than as the establishment of something entirely new. The honor in which episcopacy and the prayer book were now held was mainly confined to the royalist gentry and to scholars expelled from the universities, and was therefore understood to be closely connected with political aims. Even so, there was no attempt as yet on the part of the government to suppress the use of the prayer book in private houses, and there is reason to suppose that if no political disturbances had followed, no such attempt would have been made at a later time. The system of the Protectorate was undoubtedly the most tolerant yet known in England, more tolerant, indeed, than public opinion would, if left to itself, have sanctioned. Not only by its legal reforms did the Protectorate strive to commend itself to the nation. Oliver had never thrown his heart into the Dutch war, and a little before he dissolved the Long Parliament, a great English victory in a battle which began off Portland and ended under Cape Grisnez had secured the mastery of the Channel to the English fleet. That fleet rallied to the new government. Even Blake, who was hostile at first, accepting the result of political changes and finally throwing in his lot with the Protectorate, on the ground that it was the business of the Navy to leave politics alone and, though the expression is not traceable on sufficient evidence to Blake's lips, quote, "to keep foreigners from fooling us," close quote. The wound that Blake received off Portland incapacitated him from taking a considerable part in the later battles of the war, the burden lying for the most part on Monk, who won victories off the Gabbard in June and off the Texel in July, not long after the nominated Parliament had entered on its unlucky career. In the latter conflict, Tromp, the great Dutch admiral, whose ill success was due not to any failure of his powers, or to any want of manliness in his crews, but to the inefficiency of the government he served, was killed by a shot as he was entering into the battle. Even whilst the nominated Parliament was still in session, a negotiation with the Dutch had been opened, and this negotiation, which was countenanced by Oliver from the first, and carried on earnestly by him as Protector, ended in a peace signed on April 5, 1654. Those who wish to estimate the value of Oliver's foreign policy and its bearing upon the fortunes of the government he hoped to establish will do well to study at length the story of his negotiation with the Dutch and of his contemporary excursions into the domain of continental affairs. It is beyond doubt that he was desirous of peace with the Dutch on the ground that they were Protestants, and that he was also desirous of allying himself with other Protestant states for the protection of Protestants under persecution by Roman Catholic governments. Yet, not only did this fail to hinder him from exacting hard terms from the Dutch, but the motive of his diplomacy is revealed in his eagerness to make an agreement with his actual enemies a step to immediate hostilities with other nations. At one time, he proposed a plan for the partition between England and the Netherlands of so much of the globe as lies outside Europe, whilst he was at the same time negotiating with the governments of France and Spain, offering to make common cause with one or the other in the war then raging between them. No doubt some religious element could be imported into either quarrel. To help Spain against France, at least in the way he proposed, was to vindicate the French Protestants against a persecution to which they were to some extent exposed, in spite of the acceptance by their government of the Edict of Nantes. To assist France against Spain was to weaken the most bigoted Roman Catholic government in existence. What we are concerned with, however, is not the details of Oliver's foreign policy, but its conception as a whole. It is true that the existing position of affairs in Europe, in which France and Spain were neutralizing the forces of one another, was almost an invitation to the strong military and naval power of the Protectorate to extend its influence at the expense of one or other of the rivals. But, so far as this consideration may have played its part in bringing Oliver to a decision, it has left no traces in his recorded words. Obviously, when he undertook the negotiation with the Dutch, he had two courses before him, either to lay the foundations of a general peace, or to leave himself free to push military and naval enterprises in other directions. It was the latter course on which he resolved, a course which has gained him the admiration of a posterity prompt to recognize in Oliver the ruler who, having received from the Commonwealth an excellently organized army and navy, was the first to apply those potent instruments of conquest to the acquisition of oversea dominion. What posterity has failed to observe is that this design was incompatible with his other design of settling the government of England on a constitutional basis. By his resolve to seek military employment for the magnificent force that he had welded together, and to find reasons for going to war with some nation or other, rather than be driven into war by the necessity of upholding the honor and interests of the country, Oliver was compelled to keep up a military and naval establishment which may not have been in excess of the taxable capacity of the nation, but which at all events imposed a burden much heavier than that to which Englishmen had been accustomed to submit. Before Parliament met, after many hesitations, he had resolved to send out one fleet under Blake into the Mediterranean to enforce the release of English prisoners taken by the pirates of the Barbary coast, and another fleet under Penn to seize upon Hispaniola or some other West Indian island as a response to the refusal of Spain to allow English merchantmen to trade even with English colonies in the West Indies, as well as to various acts of violence already committed by Spanish officials in American waters. That in both these cases Oliver was justified in seeking redress can hardly be denied. As regards Spain, he had already made a twofold demand on Cardenas, the Spanish ambassador, first, for liberty of trade in the Indies, not necessarily, so far as our information goes, for liberty of trade with Spanish possessions, and secondly, for entire liberty of religion for English merchants and sailors in their own houses on Spanish soil and in their ships in Spanish ports, he not being satisfied with the offer of Spain to renew the stipulations of the treaty signed by Charles I, in which the Inquisition was debarred from acting against English Protestants so long as they created no scandal. Both demands were promptly rejected. Quote, "It is," replied Cardenas, "to ask my master's 2 eyes." Close quote. Oliver's notion that he could attack a Spanish colony in the West Indies and yet remain at peace with Spain can only be explained by his admiration for Elizabethan methods, which led him to suppose that the existing Spanish government would be as ready as that of Philip II to put up with a system which kept peace in Europe whilst war was being waged in America. It is not, however, with problems of international morality that we are at present concerned. Before Blake could sail for the Mediterranean, or Penn for the West Indies, Parliament would meet, and would be confronted with the fact that, in addition to his fleets, the Protector had on foot a land force of 57,000 men, a number exceeding by no less than 27,000 the 30,000 which the instrument itself had laid down as the normal strength of the army. It is true that he could hardly have met his engagements with a smaller force. Ireland was only recently subdued. An insurrection against the English conquerors, known as Glencairn's Rising, was in full swing in Scotland. The dread of a royalist movement in England required the maintenance of more troops than would be needed in quieter times, whilst other regiments were already preparing for embarkation in the West Indian fleet. On the other hand, when it is remembered that it was through his command of the services of these soldiers that Oliver had been raised to power, and that he could still count on their support to maintain him in it, and that he was calling upon the nation to bear the burden of enterprises which he had originated without asking its consent, can it be a matter of wonder that at such a time there should be some effort on the part of a Parliament, which had come to look upon itself as representing the nation, to impose limits upon the burdens which had already far outgrown even the prescriptions of the instrument itself? The elections to the first Protectorate Parliament were held under peculiar conditions. In the boroughs still permitted to return members, the old conditions existed, but in the counties, to which a redistribution of seats had transferred the electoral power, hitherto possessed by small villages under the influence of the neighboring landowners, the instrument had established a uniform franchise of the ownership of real or personal property worth £200. So far as we can trace any direct issue before the constituencies, the elections turned on the approval or renunciation of the policy of the advanced party in the nominated Parliament, and on this the electorate gave no uncertain sound. That party was practically swept away, and a full approbation thereby accorded to the conservative policy, which had been the main strength of the appeal made to the country by the new government. It did not follow that the new constitution would meet with the same approbation. A not inconsiderable number of the Commonwealth men, such as Bradshaw and Haslerigg, sore at their expulsion from the benches of the Long Parliament, had been returned, together with a goodly company of political Presbyterians, who might be expected to do their best to free Parliament from the shackles of the instrument. End of section 10. Section 11 of Oliver Cromwell by Samuel Rawson Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tombooker. Chapter 5. The Nominated Parliament and the Protectorate, Part 2. Under these circumstances, Oliver's speech at the opening of Parliament was a masterpiece of skill. Dwelling on the points on which he and the majority of his hearers were in agreement, he kept out of sight those on which differences might arise. He called for healing and settlement, for orderly government, which might replace the confusions of the past and stem the tide of fanaticism in the present. He dwelt not on the extent of the liberty of conscience proclaimed in the instrument, but on the restrictions imposed in that document, especially on such teachers as, quote, "under the profession of Christ, hold forth and practice licentiousness," close quote. He held up for acceptance the doctrine that, when such a result was to be feared, it was the duty of the magistrate to intervene. He protested against the notion that it was anti-Christian for a minister to receive ordination, and also against the notion that the fifth monarchy was about to commence, and that it was, quote, "for men on this principle to betitle themselves that they are the only men to rule kingdoms, govern nations, and give laws to people, and determine of property and liberty and everything else," close quote. Then came Oliver's appeal for support on the grounds of the difficulties he had inherited from his predecessors: troubles in Ireland and Scotland, trade with Portugal and France interrupted, as well as a war with the Dutch, after which he set forth the benefits of the instrument, the legal and ecclesiastical reforms it had rendered possible, the peace with the Dutch, and the commercial treaties concluded with Sweden and Denmark. Finally came a hint that Parliament might well be liberal with its supplies, as in spite of the enormous burdens weighing upon it, the government had diminished by no less than £30,000 a month the assessment tax by which army and navy were in part supported. It has often been doubted whether Oliver had in him the making of a parliamentary tactician. Those who reply in the affirmative may point to this speech in defense of their opinion, especially if we accept the evidence of the Dutch ambassadors that Oliver, in words subsequently omitted from the published speech, concluded by a direct invitation to the House to take into consideration the instrument, no doubt expecting its easy acceptance by men who were as desirous of order as himself. Confirmatory of this conclusion is the fact that when the parliamentary debates opened and the question was asked whether the House was prepared to leave the government under the control of a single man, it was a member of the council who demanded that all other business should be laid aside till the instrument had been submitted to the approval of the House. When this demand had been complied with, it became evident that the majority of the members were in favor of imposing further restrictions on the Protector, which would make him no more than a tool in the hands of Parliament. Such a position Oliver absolutely declined to accept, and on its being known that Harrison had been seeking the advantage of his own party by stirring up confusion at Westminster, and had boasted that he would have 20,000 men at his back, he struck firmly and sharply. Harrison was sent for under guard, and Parliament was ordered to attend the Protector in the Painted Chamber. The speech which the Protector delivered to the members may rank as the ablest which is known to have fallen from his lips. There can be no doubt that he would personally have preferred the retention of the instrument as it stood, but he was aware of the objections taken to it, and all that we know leads us to believe that those objections were shared by members of his own council. At all events, after a justification of his own conduct in relation to the preparation of the instrument, and an argument that it had been accepted by the electors who had been bound by its terms to acknowledge the settlement of the government in a single person and Parliament, he proceeded to offer a compromise. He was prepared to substitute for the instrument a parliamentary constitution, provided that 4 conditions were admitted as fundamentals to be handed down to posterity as unassailable. The first was that the country was to be governed by a single person and a parliament. The second, that parliaments were not to make themselves perpetual. The third, that liberty of conscience should be respected. The fourth, that neither Protector nor Parliament should have absolute power over the militia. It speaks volumes for Cromwell's power of seeing into the heart of a situation that whilst the instrument of government and the absolute supremacy of a single house, with power to defy dissolution, have alike passed into the realms of unrealized theory, every one of Oliver's fundamentals has been adopted by the nation, not indeed in any written constitution, but with the stronger and more enduring guarantee of a practice accepted beyond dispute by the conscience of the people itself. The 4 fundamentals on behalf of which he now appealed to the House formed the political legacy bequeathed by him to posterity. To obtain acquiescence in this compromise, Oliver directed that no member should take his seat who refused to sign the following declaration. Quote, I do hereby freely promise and engage to be true and faithful to the Lord Protector and the Commonwealth of England, Scotland, and Ireland, and shall not, according to the tenor of the indentures whereby I am returned to serve in this present Parliament, propose or give my consent to alter the government as it is settled in one person and a Parliament." Close quote. Those who refused subscription were excluded from all participation in the business of the House. The imposition of such restriction was doubtless condemnable on the principle that the will of the electorate expressed through its representatives must be taken as final in all disputes. Neither Cromwell, however, nor his opponents had recognized such a principle. Vane and Bradshaw had been ready to exclude royalists and other unfit persons, whilst the authors of the instrument had imposed qualifications with a very similar object. If a test there was to be, the one now selected was not only the lightest possible, but it was one that had already been signed by each constituency on behalf of its members, without which formality they were not, according to the instrument, entitled to take their seats. It left them perfectly at liberty to propose any amendment of the Constitution, even to vote against any one of Oliver's fundamentals, with the exception of the first. It is impossible here to enter into details of the constitutional debates which followed. It is sufficient to say that the basis which Parliament proposed to substitute for the instrument was the revival of the negative voice, so that no constitutional innovation could be made without the Protector's consent. Of the four fundamentals, the first two, the one relating to the position of the single person, and the other refusing to Parliament the right of perpetuating itself, were accepted without opposition. The other two raised greater difficulties. The House was very far from being anxious to extend religious liberty as widely as the Protector desired, but it ultimately agreed to a form of words which practically left the decision in his hands. The absolutely insurmountable difficulty was found in the disposal of the army. In the first place, Parliament held out for the diminution of the numbers of the regular forces to the 30,000 men allowed by the instrument, and required that if more were needed, they should be raised in the form of a militia which would fall more readily under the influence of the local gentry. In the second place, the House resolved to limit its grant of supply to the taxation required for the maintenance of the army for a term of 5 years only, thus reserving to itself the ultimate financial control which spells sovereignty. Cromwell's whole soul recoiled from the acceptance of a scheme which would render nugatory the proposed constitutional restrictions of parliamentary omnipotence, by enabling Parliament, at the end of the assigned term, to stop the supplies without which the army could not be maintained, unless, indeed, when that term reached its end, the Protector chose to employ his army to crush the Parliament of 1659, as he had employed it to crush the Parliament of 1653. Parliamentary supremacy or military despotism were the alternatives which Oliver or his successor would have to face in the not very distant future. If two men ride on one horse, one of them must ride in front, and this sober physical truth is equally applicable to the realm of politics. No paper constitution, however deserving of veneration, can prevent there being some force in every nation capable of making itself supreme if it chooses to do so. It may be the constituencies, as in England at the end of the 19th century. The people consulted in mass, as in the United States, or the army, as in England in the middle of the 17th century. Such supremacy may be subjected to the checks of written or unwritten constitutions, and may be thus thrust into the background till called forth by some special crisis. But in the long run it is impossible to prevent supreme power from exerting itself. The defect of Oliver's fourth fundamental was that it sought to divide the control of the army, or, in other words, sovereignty, between Protector and Parliament, at a time when the Protector was powerless to act in defiance of the army. It is useless to deny that he was perfectly in the right in hesitating to hand over supreme power to a Parliament uncontrolled by the nation, and capable of using its financial authority to demolish any system of government that might stand in the way of the ambitions of its members. It is equally undeniable that, as he was unable to depend on the nation as a whole, he had nothing to fall back upon except a protectorate which, in reality, was controlled by the will of the leading officers, who found in the provisions of the instrument which they had themselves originated the means of perpetuating their own power by securing, irrespective of the concurrence of Parliament or nation, the levy of taxes, the amount of which was fixed by the Protector and Council alone. Oliver, having once made up his mind to refuse his consent to the new constitution, was anxious to hasten the dissolution of the Parliament. The instrument having provided that the House should sit for 5 months, he opportunely remembered that the months by which the army's pay was regulated were lunar months, and on January 22, 1655, when 5 lunar months were expired, he pronounced its dissolution. The speech in which he announced his determination was stamped with vexation of spirit at the failure of his hopes, a vexation in itself by no means unjustifiable. The tragedy of the situation lay in the undoubted fact that however much they might differ on the means to be pursued, the end at which Protector and Parliament aimed was identical, namely, the conversion of the military into the civil state. Parliament had counted it well done to leave Oliver in possession for 5 years, whilst Oliver, conscious of his own rectitude of purpose, and ignoring the consideration that at the end of 5 years he might no longer be living, and that the Protectorate might have passed by demise into less worthy hands, complained that he was not trusted. Why, he asked, had they not come to him to talk the matter over? Why, indeed, except that parliaments have their pride as well as protectors, and that this one had come to the conclusion that it was its duty to settle the Constitution rather than to accept a settlement from a knot of soldiers. If it did not seek an opportunity to discuss such grave questions with Oliver in person, at least it had had the advantage of listening to what might be presumed to be his views when promulgated by those members of his council who were also members of the House. In an elaborate defense of the instrument, Oliver put his finger on the real ground of offense. Quote, "Although," he declared in speaking of the rights of the Protector, "for the present the keeping up and having in his power the militia seems the most hard, yet, if it should be yielded up at such a time as this, when there is as much need to keep this cause by it, which is evidently at this time impugned by all the enemies of it, as there was to get it, what would become of all? Or if it should not be equally placed in him and the Parliament, but yielded up at any time, it determines the power," close quote, i.e., hinders the exercise of authority by the person in possession of power, quote, "either from doing the good he ought, or hindering parliaments from perpetuating themselves, or from imposing what religion they please on the consciences of men, or what government they please upon the nation, thereby subjecting us to dissettlement in every parliament, and to the desperate consequences thereof. And if the nation shall happen to fall into a blessed peace, how easily and certainly will their charge be taken off, and their forces disbanded, and then where will the danger be to have the militia thus stated?" Close quote. It was impossible for the Protector to put his case more convincingly. Yet, admirable as a criticism pointing out the danger likely to follow on the adoption of the proposals of Parliament, Cromwell's reasoning presupposed the acceptance by Parliament of his own conviction that an armed minority had the right to impose its principles on the unarmed majority, the very belief which the authors of the Parliamentary Constitution were most determined to resist. Even if it had been possible for any Puritan party to look for a solution of the problem in an appeal to the unfettered judgment of the nation, it is evident that Oliver would never have agreed to such an arbitration. On the one side was the resolve to get what appeared to be the right thing done, if necessary, by force. On the other side was the resolve to eliminate the element of force by subordinating it to the rule of parliaments. For the moment, the decisive word rested with Oliver. Quote, "I think myself bound," he said in conclusion, "as in my duty to God and to the people of these nations, for their safety and good in every respect, I think it my duty to tell you that it is not for the profit of these nations, nor for the common and public good, for you to continue longer. And therefore I do declare unto you that I do dissolve this Parliament." Close quote. History has pronounced in favor of the view taken by Oliver's antagonists. The reliance on military power in which he had found his refuge did more than all other facts put together to establish, for good or for evil, a reliance on Parliament. It is the special mark of his greatness that he put his whole heart after the dissolution of his first Parliament into an effort to avoid the appearance even of a temporary dictatorship. He shrank from being a military ruler, even under the plea of the necessity of the times. His holding back the dissolution of Parliament till the 5th month, lunar month as it was, had been accomplished, offers the keynote of the position as he judged it. The Parliamentary Constitution had perished stillborn. The constitution of the instrument was in full force, and was to be observed, even though it were to his own detriment. The instrument enabled the Protector and Council to levy such taxation as they thought fit for 30,000 men and for a navy sufficient for defense, whilst he had now on foot some 57,000 soldiers, and, in addition to the home fleet, 2 others had already been dispatched, one to the Mediterranean, the other to the West Indies. Yet the Protector was able to announce that he would content himself with levying the assessment money at the low amount of £80,000 a month on the 3 nations, an amount which the dissolved Parliament had fixed as sufficient for the forces named in the instrument. Such a decision left the government with enormous forces, as forces were in those days reckoned, which it had no visible means of paying. But it was an announcement in the most practical form that, as soon as the existing situation would admit, the military expenditure should be brought down to the requirements of the instrument. The announcement was accompanied by a proclamation setting forth the principles on which the Protector had decided to act on the thorny question of religious liberty. There was to be complete freedom for all who contented themselves with setting forth their opinions without, quote, imposing, close quote, on the conscience of others or disturbing their worship. The last clause, which was aimed at the new Society of Friends, commonly styled Quakers by the irreverent multitude, sought to put a stop to their practice of carrying on their polemics in churches where congregations were assembled. To the exhortations of George Fox himself, the Protector listened with respect. Quote, "Come again to my house," said Oliver, "for if thou and I were but an hour a day together, we should be nearer one to the other. I wish you no more ill than I do to my own soul." Close quote. A reverence for genuineness, in whatever shape, was not the least admirable of Oliver's characteristics. The clause against, quote, imposing, close quote, was more widely sweeping in its aims. It struck at the claims of the Roman papacy and the English episcopacy, as well as at the designs of the late Parliament to establish lists of opinions to which toleration should be refused. It struck also at all attempts to snatch at political power with the object of serving religious ends. Oliver's breach with Parliament had roused attacks from every quarter. There were the Fifth Monarchy men, who rejected every form of secular government, and whose leaders were not to be silenced except by placing them under guard. Harrison himself had to be placed under arrest. It was not work that Oliver would have chosen. Quote, "I know," wrote Thurlow, "it is a trouble to my Lord Protector to have any one that is a saint in truth to be grieved or dissatisfied with him." Close quote. The Cavaliers might be regarded as hereditary enemies. In the last summer, a Cavalier plot to assassinate the Protector had been discovered, and 2 of the plotters, Gerard and Vowel, had been executed. Whilst Parliament was still in session, Thurlow's spies, who were to be found in every land in which their services were required, brought him news of a projected insurrection, and it had been one of Oliver's charges against the members that their delay in settling the government had fostered the plot. In March, futile attempts to rise were made in various parts of the country. the only one of which gained the dignity of an actual insurrection, being that in which Penruddock and others gathered in arms at Salisbury, seized the judges of assize in their beds, and marched off in the hope of rallying the scattered royalists of the West. The insurgents, however, were dispersed in Devonshire, where many of them were captured. In the end, a few of the ringleaders were tried and executed, whilst a large number of their adherents were transported without legal trial to Barbados. Such procedure, whether it be counted as an evasion or as a breach of the law, was evidence of the difficulty which Oliver would increasingly feel in meeting his enemies otherwise than by the exertion of arbitrary power. A more difficult question arose when two judges sent to try royalist prisoners in the north doubted their competency, on the ground that an ordinance defining the offences constituting treason, which the Protector, in accordance with the instrument, had issued before the meeting of Parliament, could not make a rebellion against the Protectorate to be high treason. The two judges were at once dismissed, and soon afterwards Chief Justice Rollet was compelled to resign office, because he was unwilling to enforce the payment of customs upon a certain coney, whilst the three lawyers who argued on Coney's behalf, one of them being Sergeant Maynard, who lived to welcome William III, that he was not to pay duties imposed by Protector and Council without the consent of Parliament, were sent to prison till they had apologized. One historian after another has accompanied his account of these proceedings with the observation that there was here a conflict between law and the tyrant's plea, necessity. There was nothing of the sort. The question was whether the instrument was a valid constitution. If it was, there could be no reasonable doubt that rebels against the Protectorate were legally traitors, or that customs duties applicable to the payment of the army and the navy were legally set, not by Parliament, but by Protector and Council. If all that Oliver and his councillors had asked of the instrument had been to enable them to carry on the government till the lapse of 3 years drove them to summon another Parliament, they might have been well content. They could not, however, forget that they were the leaders of the party of reform, and the instrument itself had deprived them of the power of initiating reforms except through Parliament. The authority to issue ordinances with the force of law had ceased with the meeting of Parliament, and all that could now be done was to urge the commissioners of the Great Seal to carry out the ordinance for the reform of Chancery, and, upon their refusal, to replace them by others likely to be more complacent. The result was a movement in opposition to the instrument amongst some of Oliver's partisans, by which he was hampered as well as assisted. It was natural that such a movement should also have the character of opposition to the military party from whom the instrument had proceeded. Already in the late Parliament, an unsuccessful effort had been made to confer the title of King on Oliver, in the hope that the civilian element in the government would be thereby strengthened. In the summer of 1655, a petition was circulated in the city asking the Protector to assume legislative power on the invitation of the subscribers. Oliver was far too prudent to follow such a will-o'-the-wisp, and the petition was suppressed by the council. The needs that had called it forth could not so easily be dismissed, especially as the Protector's desire to reform abuses was strongly reinforced by his need of money, a need which was dramatically exhibited when the soldiers of his guard broke into his kitchen and carried off the dinner cooked for his own table, telling him to his face that as they had not received their pay, they had taken some of it in kind. If Oliver was to make both ends meet, it could only be by reductions in the army, and to effect these he needed the cooperation of the officers. Whilst so far as Scotland and Ireland were concerned, reductions which might have been dangerous in January had ceased to be dangerous in July. Monk, who had been sent back to the north as soon as he could be spared from the Dutch war, had reduced the Highlands to submission, and Ireland, which had been earlier subjected by English arms, was now to have imposed on her that thoroughgoing system of English colonization which is usually known as the Cromwellian settlement, the principles of which had, however, been laid down by preceding governments. Those of the landowning class who were unable to prove, to the satisfaction of English judges, that they had shown constant good affection to the English government, even if they had taken no part against England in the late war, that is to say, the great bulk of the class which had anything to lose amongst the Irish Catholics, were driven off into the devastated lands of Connaught, and their estates were divided amongst English soldiers and other Englishmen who had lent money for the support of the war upon the security of confiscated land. Henceforth there was to be in 3 of the Irish provinces a class of landed proprietors of English birth and the Protestant religion, surrounded by peasants and laborers who were divided from them by racial and religious differences of the most extreme kind. Such an arrangement boded ill for the future peace of the country. The immediate result was untold misery to the sufferers, and the kindling of a hope in English bosoms that at last Ireland would be peopled by a race loyal to the institutions and religion of her conquerors. In any case, the scheme for the plantation of Ireland would diminish the number of soldiers required to hold the country, and before the end of July, the assent of the chiefs of the army in England having been obtained, the Council also sanctioned not merely a sweeping reduction in the strength of the regiments in Great Britain, but a diminution of the amount of the pay both of officers and soldiers. Once more Oliver had acted in accordance with the instrument, and with the wishes of the dissolved Parliament. The £60,000 a month, which Parliament had thought sufficient for the assessment, was not exceeded, whilst the army was reduced at least approximately to the numbers accepted alike by Parliament and the instrument. It might be hard to give a satisfactory answer to those who denied the validity of the instrument, but if this validity were acknowledged, it would be equally hard to refute those who argued that Oliver was doing his best to rule as a constitutional magistrate. Would it be possible for Oliver to persist in this attitude to the end, in spite of the growing demands on the exchequer? In March 1655, Penruddock's Rising had extracted from Oliver an order for the calling out and organization of the militia, which was, however, countermanded upon the prompt repression of the insurrection. In May, however, The officers who recommended the reduction of the army also recommended the establishment of a militia for purposes of police. And as the summer advanced, and the information which came in from Thurloe's spies announced that the royalist plots were by no means at an end, this plan assumed greater consistency. The scheme of appointing a militia police had at least this to be said in its favor, that the proposal had been favored by Parliament. If Parliament had been allowed to work out its own scheme, it would probably have subjected the militia to local officers and provided for its wants by local payments. Oliver took care to bring it into disciplinary connection with the army by placing it under 11 major generals. Taxation for its support he could not demand without infringing on the instrument. In his perplexity he, or one of his advisers, hit upon a plan for raising supplies from the royalists alone, who were called on to contribute 1/10 of their income for the purpose. It was their refusal to submit peaceably to a settled government which had caused the difficulty, and it was for them to bear the expense of the measures which had been necessitated by their misconduct. Such an exaction, being no general taxation, might be considered by interested parties as saving the authority of the instrument. Of any sympathetic feeling with the royalists, whose property had been diminished by past confiscations, and whose political and religious ideals had been thrown to the ground, there was, it is needless to say, nothing in Oliver's mind. They were but enemies to be crushed, or at least to be reduced to impotence. That the royalists had religious ideals of their own was a provocation which made it easy to deny them the toleration which they had hitherto virtually enjoyed. The familiar cadences of the Book of Common Prayer had become to them a symbol of political as well as of religious faith, whilst the voice of the often long-winded and sometimes irrelevant ejaculator of prayers of his own conception stood for them as the embodiment of the forces which had conspired to murder their king, to deprive them of the broad acres sold to satisfy the demands of sequestrators, and to exclude them from all share in the public interests of the country which they loved as devotedly as any Puritan could possibly do. It was now that Oliver committed the mistake, which thousands of others in like circumstances have committed, of confounding the symbol with the cause. The use of the Common Prayer Book was proscribed as thoroughly as the Mass. Noblemen and gentlemen were prohibited from entertaining the ejected clergy of their own church as chaplains or tutors of their children. Yet, after all, the persecution was sharp only for a time, and not only was the inquisition into the religious practices of domestic life soon abandoned, but the Episcopalian clergy were led to understand that no harm should befall them so long as they abstained from thrusting themselves upon the notice of the public. It was not only in relation to religious toleration that Oliver was driven by his position to modify his earlier principles. At one time he had fully sympathized with the independent party in its efforts to secure the liberty of the press. Of libels on his own character and person he had been widely tolerant. Step by step, the Long Parliament had imposed restrictions on the press, and these restrictions were continued under the Protectorate. At last, in October 1655, the final blow fell. Only 2 weekly newspapers were permitted to appear, and both these newspapers were to be edited by an agent of the government. Milton, now incapacitated by blindness from active employment in the service of the state, must have winced at hearing that his chosen hero, who had long ago turned his back on a voluntary system of church government, had now turned his back on the central doctrine of the Areopagitica. Oliver, we may be sure, took all these proceedings as a matter of course. He held himself to have been placed in the seat of authority not to advance the most beneficent theories, but to keep order after the fashion of a constable in a discordant world. Neither Milton nor himself believed in the political rights of majorities. If the nation chose to raise itself up against the cause of God, so much the worse for the nation. Quote, "I say," he had announced to his first Parliament, "that the willful throwing away of this government, so owned by God, so approved by men, so testified to in the fundamentals of it, and that in relation to the good of these nations and posterity, I can sooner be willing to be rolled into my grave and buried with infamy than I can give my consent unto." Close quote. Oliver doubtless held that the partitioning of England into 11 districts, each under a military chief, was consistent with at least a literal observance of, quote, "this government," close quote, as he himself had called it. It is possible that if the major generals had confined themselves to keeping watch over the royalist gentry, with occasionally breaking up their religious meetings, and with driving away the chaplains and the tutors of their sons, they would have caused less irritation than they did. The army, however, or in plainer terms, the occupants of its higher posts, from the Lord Protector downwards, were the most systematic upholders of that aggressive Puritan morality which was diluted with greater worldliness in other circles. It is no doubt untrue that justices of the peace, as has sometimes been suggested, were altogether inefficient during the Protectorate, but they were not loved by the Cavalier gentry, whose estates were often larger than their own, and, like all local authorities, they were hampered by the local feeling which, even amongst those who willingly accepted the Protectorate, was, though certainly not Episcopalian, far from being as acutely Puritan as was desired at headquarters. A statute inflicting the penalty of death upon adulterers had been reduced almost to a dead letter by the unwillingness of juries to convict, and, to take an instance from the daily amusements of the people, the Bear Garden at Southwark had survived the prohibition of one Puritan government after another, till, a few weeks after the appointment of the Major Generals, Pride, who had once blocked the doors of Parliament, slew the bears with his own hands and closed the exhibition. As to the Major Generals themselves, they were soon instructed to tighten the reins of discipline, cooperating with willing and spurring unwilling magistrates to suppress not merely treason and rebellion, but vice and immorality. Their orders were to put down horse racing, cock fighting, and other sports which brought together crowds of doubtful fidelity to the government. They were told to promote godliness and virtue, and to see to the execution of the laws against drunkenness, blasphemy, swearing, play acting, profanation of the Lord's day, and so forth, and also to put down gaming houses in Westminster and ale-houses in the country, lest evil and factious men should congregate in them. They were to keep an open eye on the beneficed clergy, calling for the ejection of those who either showed tendencies favorable to the Book of Common Prayer, or brought disgrace by laxity of conduct on the Puritanism they professed. During the first 6 or 9 months of 1656, when these men ruled supreme, the anti-Puritan fervor, which was before long to lay low both the Protectorate and the Commonwealth, ceased to be the special note of particular classes, and rooted itself in general society, far outside the circle of ordinary royalism. End of section 11. Section 12 of Oliver Cromwell by Samuel Rawson Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tombooker. Chapter 6. A Parliamentary Constitution, Part 1. It was all the worse for Oliver from the financial point of view that he was now pursuing a foreign policy which, whatever opinion we may have of it on other grounds, at least increased the burdens of the nation to a point at which Englishmen began to grow restive. Even before the signature of the Dutch peace in the spring of 1654, Oliver had cast about in his mind for a foreign policy, and it was only on rare occasions that he appears to have contemplated the possibility of keeping peace with all nations, unless he were compelled to engage in war in defense of the honor or interests of the country. He seems to have regarded the victorious fleet bequeathed to him by the Commonwealth and the victorious army, which he had done more than any other man to forge into an instrument of dominion, as inviting him to choose an enemy to be the object of his defiance, rather than sure guards for the country which he ruled. The sword itself drew on the man, and the weakness of the two great continental nations, France and Spain, embroiled in an internecine war, each coveting the alliance of England, and each dreading her enmity, increased its attractive power. Not that Oliver was without principles underlying his actions. He had indeed two, not always easily reconcilable. He wanted to increase the trade of the country by strengthening its maritime power, and he wanted to uphold the cause of God in Europe by the formation of a great Protestant alliance against what he believed to be the aggressive papacy. This second principle gave to his actions a nobility which only an honest devotion to higher than material interests can impart, whilst at the same time it led him into the greatest practical mistakes of his career, because he was always ready to overestimate the persecuting tendencies of the Roman Catholic states, which, since the Peace of Westphalia, had been local and spasmodic, and to overestimate the strength of religious conviction in the rulers of Protestant states, as well as to imagine it possible to unite these last in a Protestant crusade. It was a still more deplorable result that his own character became somewhat deteriorated by the constant effort to persuade himself that he was following the higher motives, when in reality material considerations weighed most heavily in the scale. In truth, Oliver's day of rule lay between two worlds. The world in which the existence of Protestantism had been really at stake, at the time when men so alien from the dogmatism of the sects as Drake, Raleigh, and Sidney had enlisted in its cause, and the world of trade and manufacture which was springing into being. Oliver's mind comprehended both. Doubtless his mind was the roomier that it could respond to the double current, but it was not to be expected that a generation whose face was set in the direction of material interests should be otherwise than impatient of a call to the heavens to place themselves on the side of English trade. During the greater part of 1654, Oliver had been hesitating whether to ally himself with Spain or with France. For some time he inclined to the side of Spain. His religious sympathies were touched by the sufferings of the French Huguenots. The succor which he proposed to convey to them would have brought him into direct alliance with Spain, and it was only the revelation of Spanish financial and military weakness which turned him aside from this project. Then came a suggestion long weighed and finally taken up for carrying on war against the Spanish West Indies. It would be hard to deny that, even in modern eyes, a casus belli, apart from all ideal schemes of weakening the government which sheltered the Inquisition, was to be found, not in the refusal of the Spanish authorities to allow English ships to trade in the Spanish islands, but in the deliberate seizure of English ships and the enslavement of English crews guilty of no other crime than that of being bound for Barbados or for some other English colony. The strangest part of the matter is that Oliver closed his eyes to the natural consequence of an attack upon a Spanish colony. He fancied that it would be still possible to carry out the Elizabethan plan of keeping peace in Europe and making war in the Indies. He was probably strengthened in this opinion by the fact that, almost from the first days of the Commonwealth, a war of reprisals had been going on at sea with France without disturbing the nominally amicable relations between the two countries. Why should he not take a West Indian island as a reprisal for the seizure of English ships, and peace be maintained with Spain as if nothing had happened? Before the end of 1654, two fleets sailed on their several missions. The one, under Blake, entered the Mediterranean, where he was most hospitably received by the governors of the Spanish ports and by the officials of the Grand Duke of Tuscany at Leghorn. He ransomed a number of English captives at Algiers, but the Bey of Tunis, some of whose subjects had recently been sold for galley slaves to the Knights of Malta by an English scoundrel, was naturally less compliant. Blake destroyed 9 of his vessels at Porto Farina, but Tunis itself was inaccessible, and he was unable to recover a single English slave from that quarter. Penn sailed for Barbados, with some 2,500 soldiers on board under Venables. Both in Barbados and in other English islands, reinforcements were shipped, and with this ill-compounded force, a landing was effected in Hispaniola. The attempt to seize on the city of San Domingo failed, and the expedition sailed for Jamaica, at that time little more than a desert island, and established itself in possession. Some years passed before the colony became self-supporting, but Oliver was unremitting in his resolution not only to increase the numbers of the first military settlers, but to supply them with all things necessary for the foundation of homes in the wilderness. It was annoying that the first operations in the Spanish West Indies had opened with a check, but it was doubtless fortunate that the new English colony was not built up on Spanish foundations. The soldiers who, on their march towards San Domingo, pelted with oranges an image of the Virgin which they had torn down from the walls of a deserted monastery, would hardly have been at their best in the midst of a Roman Catholic population. Much to Oliver's surprise, the news of the proceedings of his men in Hispaniola aroused the bitterest indignation at Madrid, an indignation already to some extent aroused when Blake sailed out through the Straits of Gibraltar to meet and capture the treasure ships expected from America. The features of Philip IV, as, thanks to the brush of Velázquez, they meet us in every noted gallery in Europe, are not those of a man remarkable for wisdom, but he had none of the lingering hesitancy of his grandfather, Philip II. He ordered the seizure of the property of English merchants in Spanish harbors, and Oliver, after balancing for 2 years between France and Spain, had the question decided by his own mistaken belief that the world of Elizabeth remained unchanged. The breach with Spain necessitated a reconsideration of the relations between England and France. Ever since his accession to the Protectorate, Oliver had evaded the demands of the French ambassador, Bordeaux, for a cessation of the war of reprisals at sea which had been bequeathed him by the Commonwealth. As English privateers captured more prizes than those of the French, he was in no hurry to bring the situation to an end till he obtained of Mazarin, the virtual ruler of France, a tacit understanding that the Huguenots should no longer be maltreated, and an express undertaking to expel from France the English royal family and the chief royalists in attendance on the exiled court. Whilst these questions were still under discussion, an event occurred which, more than any other single action in his life, brought into relief the higher side of Cromwell's character and policy. In January 1655, the young Duke of Savoy, or rather his mother, who, though he had come to years of discretion, acted in his name, ordered that the Vaudois, whose religion, though now akin to the Protestantism of the 17th century, dated from medieval times, should be removed from the plain at the foot of the Piedmontese valleys into which they had spread, to the upper and barer reaches, on the pretext that they had broken the bounds assigned them by his ancestors. In April his troops entered the valley, slaying and torturing as they went. When the news reached England in May, Oliver's heart was moved to its depths. He ordered a day of humiliation to be held, and a house-to-house visitation to collect money for the sufferers. Upwards of £38,000 was gathered in the end, the Protector heading the list with £2,000. He sent a minister to Turin to remonstrate, but his warmest appeals were addressed to Mazarin, the all-powerful minister of Louis XIV, as some French troops, acting as allies of the Duke in his war against the Spaniards in Italy, had been concerned in the massacre. Mazarin was plainly told that there would be no treaty with France till these massacres were stopped. The French minister had been so long deluded in his hope of a treaty that this threat alone might not have terrified him, but he feared that Oliver would hire the Protestant Swiss to take part against the Duke of Savoy, and that all thought of fighting the Spaniards in Italy would have to be laid aside for that year. Communications passed between Paris and Turin, and the Duke of Savoy issued his pardon, such was the term employed, to the surviving Vaudois. Milton's sonnet marks well this highest point of the Protector's action upon continental states. Avenge, O Lord, thy slaughtered saints, whose bones lie scattered on the Alpine mountains cold, even them who kept thy truth so pure of old, when all our fathers worshipped stocks and stones. Forget not, in thy book record their groans, who were thy sheep, and in their ancient fold slain by the bloody Piedmontese that rolled mother with infant down the rocks. Their moans the vales redoubled to the hills, and they to heaven. Their martyred blood and ashes sow o'er all the Italian fields, where still doth sway the triple tyrant, that from these may grow 100-fold, who having learnt thy way, early may fly the Babylonian woe. In championing the Vaudois, Oliver's Puritanism had served the noblest interests of humanity. With somewhat of the poet's fervor, Milton saw in the defense of the oppressed victims of the Duke of Savoy a challenge to the spiritual tyranny of papal Rome. It made Oliver, we may be sure, more ready to take up the challenge of Spain, and to come to terms with the French government, which had spoken on the side of tolerance. Yet, enthusiastically Puritan as he was, he could not deal with the external affairs of England from a merely or even a mainly religious point of view. His position would not allow it, nor his character. The mingling of spiritual with worldly motives might produce strange results. At one time, it elevated and ennobled action. At another time, the two motives might clash together, the one frustrating the other. In the stand taken by Oliver on behalf of the Vaudois, the spiritual had predominated over the material aim. In the breach with Spain, his belief in the predominance of the religious motive burnt strongly in Oliver's own mind. It was less conspicuous to onlookers. The first result of the quarrel between England and Spain was the conclusion of a commercial treaty with France, which put an end to the war of reprisals which had now lasted more than 6 years. All question of a closer alliance was reserved, perhaps rather because it demanded time for consideration than because there was any doubt in Oliver's mind as to his intention in the matter. Before the war had been far prolonged, the exiled king took refuge in the Spanish Netherlands, holding close communication with Englishmen who plotted the destruction of the Protector, whilst privateers issuing from Dunkirk and Ostend preyed upon English commerce and irritated the London merchants who had no enthusiasm for a religious war and who regretted the loss of their goods seized in Spanish ports. In the spring and summer of 1656, the necessity of doing something against an active enemy established so near the English coast would have driven Oliver into the arms of France, even if he had not already contemplated such an alliance. Yet it was during these very months that the desired end seemed to be eluding his grasp. Mazarin, unwilling to allow an English garrison to occupy Dunkirk as the price of the Protector's alliance, was doing his best to come to terms with Spain, which would have enabled him to dispense with English aid. It was not till the approach of autumn that the French minister, discovering that his overtures to Philip IV had been made in vain, bowed to the inevitable, and agreed to hand over Dunkirk to England, if it could be wrested from Spain by the united effort of the two countries. What a vista was opened up of vast military and naval expenditure by the mere enunciation of such a project! The reduction of the army in the summer of 1655 could hardly be maintained under these altered circumstances, and with an increased army and navy, what chance was there for that government according to the instrument, which had been the cornerstone of Oliver's domestic policy? The difficulty was the greater because in the summer of 1656 it appeared that the plan of policing the country by a militia under major generals had broken down financially. Meetings of officers were summoned in June to discuss the situation, and though the Protector was at first inclined to raise fresh taxation on his own sole authority, he soon recognized that such a step would be too unpopular to meet with success, and resolved that another Parliament must be summoned. Before the new Parliament met, Oliver had recourse to one of those startling privileges which the instrument might be quoted as having conferred on his government. That constitution assigned to the Council the right of examining and rejecting such members as might be elected without possessing the qualifications imposed by it on members of Parliament, a right which the Council now exercised in the rejection of at least 93 hostile members. In the case of royalists chosen by constituencies, the Council was undoubtedly in the right in annulling their elections, at least so far as the Constitution was concerned. In refusing admission to Republicans like Scott and Haslerigg, it was compelled to have recourse to a quibble. It was true that the Council was empowered by the instrument to reject members who were not, quote, of known integrity, close quote. That body, with at least the tacit approval of the Protector, now interpreted those words as giving them power to reject members not of known integrity to the existing Constitution. For once in his life, Oliver demeaned himself to act in the spirit of a pettifogging attorney. Base as the action was, it was only possible because the greater number of those admitted to their seats whether through the pressure put upon the country by the major generals, or because they looked with more hopefulness to the Protector, were now prepared to give him their support. In the speech with which Oliver opened the session on September 17, he did his best to rouse the indignation of his hearers against Spain. Quote, "Why, truly," he urged, "your great enemy is the Spaniard. He is a natural enemy. He is naturally so. He is naturally so throughout, by reason of that enmity that is in him against whatsoever is of God." Close quote. It was the keynote of Oliver's feeling in this matter in his more exalted mood. His sentiments as a patriotic Englishman found vent in a long catalogue of wrongs suffered at the hands of Spaniards from Elizabeth's time to his own. His defiance of Spain was followed by an attack on Charles Stuart, now dwelling on Spanish soil, and hopefully looking to Spain for troops to replace him on the throne, in which he referred to him as, quote, "a captain to lead us back into Egypt." Close quote. Then came a retrospect on the Cavalier plots and a justification of the major generals who had been established to repress them. The war with Spain must be prosecuted vigorously. In other words, money must be voted to maintain the struggle at home and abroad. Oliver's speech did not all turn upon what ordinary men term politics. Quote, "Make it a shame," he cried, "to see men bold in sin and profaneness, and God will bless you. You will be a blessing to the nation, and by this will be more repairers of breaches than by anything in the world. Truly, these things do respect the souls of men and the spirits, which are the men. The mind is the man. If that be kept pure, a man signifies somewhat. If not, I would very fain see what difference there is betwixt him and a beast. He hath only some activity to do some more mischief." Close quote. It was the voice of the higher, because more universal, Puritanism which rang in these words, a voice which soared to worlds above the region of ceremonial form or doctrinal dispute, echoing, as from the lips of a man of practical wrestlings with the world, the voice of the imaginative poet who, in the days of his youth, had taught that, "So dear to heaven is saintly chastity that, when a soul is found sincerely so, 1,000 liveried angels lackey her, driving far off each thing of sin and guilt, and in clear dream and solemn vision tell her of things that no gross ear can hear, till oft converse with heavenly habitants begin to cast a beam on the outward shape, the unpolluted temple of the mind, and turns it by degrees to the soul's essence, till all be made immortal." Oliver had to touch earth again with a financial statement and to crave for parliamentary supplies. A demand for money was not particularly welcome to the members, and they preferred to wrangle for some weeks over the case of James Naylor, a fanatic who had allowed himself to be greeted as the Messiah by his feminine admirers. In October, news came that Stainer, in command of a detachment from Blake's fleet, had destroyed or captured a part of the Plate fleet off the Spanish coast, and in the following month the carts were rolling through the London streets on their way to the Tower with silver worth £200,000. Emboldened by this success, Oliver's confidence brought in a bill perpetuating the decimation of the Royalists by Act of Parliament. The bill was rejected, and hard words were spoken of the major generals. Oliver accepted the decision of the House, and the major generals were withdrawn. There is good reason to believe that Oliver consented willingly to the vote. He was never one to persist in methods once adopted if he could obtain his larger aims in some other way. The debates had revealed that the House was divided into two parties, a minority clinging to the army as a political force, and a majority calling for the establishment of the government on a civil basis. The latter was even more devoted to the Protector than the former, and Oliver, who in his heart concurred with their views, was prepared, as indeed he had been prepared in 1654, to submit the instrument to revision. The difference was that he was assured now, as he had not been assured then, that Parliament would sustain the fundamental principles which he regarded as the most precious part of the Constitution. In January 1657, a fresh attempt to assassinate the Protector, this time by Miles Sindercombe, gave reason, or perhaps excuse, for loyal demonstrations, and a month later the House entered upon the discussion of a proposal for a constitutional revision, ultimately known as the Humble Petition and Advice, of which the article which attracted the most general attention was that which reconstituted the kingship in the person of Oliver, with the power of nominating his own successor. The demand for the revival of the kingship was no mere work of zealous flatterers. The crown was held in the House to be the symbol of civilian as opposed to military government. But for this reason, the offer of it was assailed by the leading officers, headed by Lambert, who, in 1653, had offered the crown to the man to whom he now refused it. So far as the officers were concerned, they appear to have been actuated, in part at least, by a dread that a parliamentary protectorate would in the end turn out to be other than a Puritan protectorate. Lambert's own motives were somewhat more difficult to unravel. Possibly he regarded a kingship by the grace of Parliament less of a boon than a kingship by the grace of the army. Still more probably was he moved by a personal grievance in seeing Fleetwood, who had now returned from Ireland, higher than himself in the favor of the Protector, perhaps even in the favor of the army. In any case, he carried on the campaign with consummate skill, keeping aloof from the constitutional question and throwing all his strength into the argument, which the rudest soldier could understand, that the army had not rejected one king in order to set up another. When he won over Fleetwood and Desborough, the son-in-law and brother-in-law of the Protector, to his side, he had practically won the game, especially as he was able to back a petition against a revival of the royal title by the subscription of 100 officers. Oliver kept up the negotiation with Parliament as long as he could, but in the end he refused the crown offered to him rather than alienate the army. The remaining articles of the humble petition and advice were then agreed to, and on June 26, Oliver was solemnly installed as Protector under a parliamentary title with all but royal pomp at Westminster Hall. Too much has been made by some modern writers of Oliver's defeat on the question of the kingship. The title, as he himself truly said, would have been but a feather in his cap. It is doubtful whether its acceptance would have disarmed a single enemy. The rocks upon which the Protector was running were of a far too substantial character to be removed by the assumption of an ill-fitting symbol. Whether he wore a crown or not, no one could have regarded Oliver as Charles I had been regarded, or even as William III, who in some sort continued the Protector's work, came afterwards to be regarded. Apart from the really unimportant question of the crown, the military party had for some time been beaten all along the line. Not only had the major generals disappeared, and Lambert himself, driven to surrender all his offices, military or civil, retired to the cultivation of tulips at Wimbledon, but the humble petition and advice, that is to say, a parliamentary constitution, had entirely displaced the instrument of government as the fundamental law of the three nations. The more important of the stipulations of the new Constitution were necessarily of the nature of a compromise. In return for the establishment of a second house composed of his own nominees, the Protector was able to abandon the claim of the Council to exclude members of what must now be regarded as the House of Commons, seeing that a vote with which he was dissatisfied would be of no avail if it was no more than the vote of a single house. Nor was it only an occasional check on the old house that he had gained. The new house, nominated by himself in the first place, was endowed with the right in the future of excluding from its benches any new member nominated by himself or by a future Protector. As he took care to name none who were not strong Puritans and devoted to the Protectorate, he expected that the new house would be able, for all time, to reject legislation contrary to the interests of Puritanism or to the protectoral constitution. The question of finance, which had wrecked the last Parliament, was settled in a way equally satisfactory to the Protector. The number of soldiers to be kept on foot was passed over in silence, whilst the same sum, £1,800,000, which had been approved by the first Protectorate Parliament as needful for the wants of the army and navy, together with those of the domestic government, was now granted, not for 5 years, as had been proposed by the former Parliament, but till the Protector and the two Houses agreed to alter it. The scheme by which the instrument had fixed the strength of the army at 30,000 men, and had then left the Protector and Council free to levy whatever supplies they thought needful for its support, was deliberately left out of account. On paper, the terms of agreement showed fairly enough. England had at last got a constitution which was no production of a military coterie. Protector and Parliament were at last at one. Unfortunately, those who had welcomed this fair concord took little account of the forces which were likely to govern events in the not far distant future. The force of the army, whose handiwork had been set at naught. The force of the parliamentary tradition, strengthened by the work of the Long Parliament. And, above all, the force of discontent with the shifting sands on which the new government was built. A discontent which might easily show itself in a national call for the restoration of the Stuart king, not because his person was loved, but because he would bring with him what appeared to be the strong basis of old use and wont. Oliver was not wholly absorbed in constitutional struggles or in foreign conflicts. In administration, his government stands supreme above all which had preceded it, because no other ruler united so wide a tolerance of divergencies of opinion with so keen an eye for individual merit. He could gather round him the enthusiastic Milton to pen those dignified state papers in which he announced his resolutions to the powers of Europe. Andrew Marvell, the most transparently honest of men, who, with all his admiration for Oliver, had mingled in the verses written by him as a panegyric on his patron those lines recording Charles's dignified appearance on the scaffold, which will be remembered when all his other writings in prose or verse are forgotten. In Oliver's council sat Bulstrode Whitelock, the somewhat stolid lawyer who, too cautious to give a precedent approval to Oliver's revolutionary acts, was always ready to accept the situation created by them, and yet sufficiently inspired by professional feeling to resign his post as Commissioner of the Great Seal rather than accept the Protector's reforms in the Court of Chancery. There, too, sat Nathaniel Fiennes, the second son of Lord Say and Seal, not indeed a statesman with broad views, but ready at any moment to pen state papers in defense of a government which had rescued him from the neglect into which he had fallen, probably undeservedly, in consequence of his hasty surrender of Bristol in the Civil War. Amongst Oliver's diplomatists were Morland and Lockhart. Amongst his admirals, the honored Blake and the ever-faithful Montague. Amongst those who at one time or another were his chaplains were Owen, the ecclesiastical statesman, and Howe, whose exemplary piety led him to doubt whether the Protector's household was sufficiently religious, and whose broad-minded charity prepared him to abandon the Church of the Restoration, not because it was un-Puritan, but because it was exclusive. Yet, after all is said, the list of ancient allies driven by the Protector from public life, and in some cases actually deprived of liberty, was even more noteworthy. The most placable of men could hardly have avoided a quarrel with John Lilburne, of whom it was said that if he alone were left alive in the world, John would dispute with Lilburne, and Lilburne with John. But it is at least remarkable that under Oliver's sway Vane, whom he had long dealt with as a brother, Harrison, who had fought under him from the very beginning of the Civil War, and who had stood by his side when the members of the Long Parliament were thrust out of doors, Haslerig, who had kept guard over the English border in the crisis of Dunbar, Oki, who had led the dragoons at Naseby, Overton, the trusted governor of Hull, next to London the most important military post in England, Lambert, who had taken a foremost part in the preparation of the instrument of government, Cooper, who had been one of his most trusted counselors, to say nothing of confidants of less conspicuous note, were either in prison or in disgrace. When the Second Protectorate, as it is sometimes called, was launched on its course, the only man not connected with the family of the Protector, who still occupied anything like an independent position, was Monk, the governor and commander-in-chief in Scotland, and it is probable that he owed his authority to the distance which kept him from interfering in English politics. The true explanation appears to be that the men from whom Oliver parted were men not merely of definite principles, but of definite ideas. Each one had made up his mind that England was to be served by the establishment of some particular form of government, or some particular course of action. Oliver's mind was certainly not without the guidance of definite principles. He could not conceive it to be right to abandon religion to men who, whether Episcopalian or Presbyterian, would impose fetters on the freedom of, quote, the people of God, close quote. He could not admit the claim of an hereditary monarch or of an elected parliament to decide against the best interests of the country. Within these limits, however, his mind was more elastic than those of his opponents. Steadied by his high aims, he could vary the methods with which he combated each evil of the day as it arose. Those who attached themselves to him in his struggle against the king, or against the different parliaments of his time, or against the military power, were as incapable as he was capable of facing round to confront each new danger as it arose. From the moment that each partial victory was won, the old friends had to be reasoned with, then discarded, and at last restrained from doing mischief. As years went on, Oliver, in spite of the abilities of those still serving under him, became increasingly an isolated man. Not only did his strong sense of religion in its Puritan form alienate those who were not Puritans, or not religious, but his frequent changes of attitude bewildered that easy-going mass of mankind which sticks to its own theory, more especially if its own interests are embodied in it, and regards all change of political method as a veil intended to conceal moral turpitude. Oliver had decidedly lost adherents since the establishment of the Protectorate. End of section 12. Section 13 of Oliver Cromwell by Samuel Rawson Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tom Booker. Chapter 6, A Parliamentary Constitution, Part 2. It was probably the increasing sense of the untrustworthiness of political support, rather than nepotism in its ordinary sense, which led the Protector to rely more and more on the services of members of his own family. His younger son, Henry Cromwell, was now Lord Deputy of Ireland. His son-in-law, Fleetwood, was not only a member of the council, but, now that Lambert was in disgrace, the most influential officer in the army, marked out for its command if Oliver were to pass away. His brother-in-law, Desborough, occupied a position hardly inferior. Two other brothers-in-law, Colonel John Jones and Colonel Valentine Wotton, were members of the council in England or Ireland. Lockhart, one of the few Scotchmen who had rallied to the Protectorate, and who was engaged as a diplomatist in riveting the bonds between France and England, took to wife the Protector's niece. A son-in-law, John Claypole, was now master of the horse. In the army, Whalley and Ingoldsby were his cousins. Not one of these, however, failed to occupy with credit the position he had acquired, whilst Oliver's reluctance to push forward Richard, the elder of his surviving sons, may be taken as evidence that his affection for his family did not override his devotion to the state. Richard's tastes lay in the direction of dogs and horses. He had recently broken his leg hunting in the New Forest, and, upon his recovery, was brought up to Westminster to assume his place on the establishment of the Second Protectorate. Before that time, only two of the councillors not holding other office, Lambert and Strickland, had received the title of, quote, Lord, close quote, probably having it verbally conferred upon them, and certainly not, as has been sometimes said, in connection with any household appointment. Officials of high rank had, like the Lord Deputy and the Lord Keeper of the old monarchy, been entitled lords, as in the case of Whitelock, now Lord Commissioner of the Treasury, and Fines, Lord Commissioner of the Great Seal. Gradually usage, quickly sanctioned by official notice, gave the title of Lord to the Protector's sons and sons-in-law, and of Lady to his daughters. The Lord Richard was only admitted to the council on the last day of 1657, and was treated with some of the observances due to the heir, but till the last his father held back from exercising that power of nominating a successor which had been conferred on him by the latest constitution. So far as in him lay, Oliver took care that his family should be an example to all the families in the land. Strict as he was in banishing not merely vice, but the folly that leads to vice, he was no more opposed to reasonable amusement than other more sober Puritans of the day. Music and song had a special charm for him, and amongst his soldiers he showed his appreciation of a healthy jest, laughing heartily, for instance, on his way to the campaign of Dunbar, when one of them slammed an overturned cream tub on the head of another. After the victory at Worcester, he was heard of in a hawking party near Aylesbury, and if he prohibited horse races, together with the drama, cockfights, and bear baitings, it was not because he disliked amusement, but partly because he set himself against the immorality with which these particular amusements were accompanied, and partly because the confluence of spectators concealed the assembling of royalists and other conspirators. Of horses he was quite as good a judge as his son Richard, and it was from a spirited pair of runaway steeds which had been given to him by the Count of Oldenburg that he nearly met his death in the early days of the Protectorate. Of late years, Oliver's enjoyment of country life had been much curtailed. Other rulers had been in the habit of making summer progresses which took them away from business and the life of towns. Oliver, if he invented nothing else, may be regarded as the inventor of that modified form of enjoyment to which hard-worked citizens have in our day given the name of the, quote, weekend, close quote. Liable to assault on every hand, he did not venture to leave the seat of government for long, and he found repose in a weekly visit to Hampton Court, which lasted from Saturday to Monday, the length of his sojourn being only rarely extended by illness or some unusual family occurrence. The domestic life of the Protector was all that might be expected from a man whose heart was as warm as his spirit was high. In the midst of his most arduous labors he seldom passed a day, as long as he was at Whitehall, on which he did not dine and sup in the family circle, and up till his aged mother's death in 1654, he was in the habit of visiting her every night before she retired to rest. Of his 4 daughters, 2 were already married. The eldest, Bridget, after the death of her first husband, Ireton, having become the wife of Fleetwood, and the second, the sprightly and graceful Elizabeth, had married John, otherwise Lord Claypole, whom the Protector had entrusted with the charge of his stables, under the style of Master of the Horse. On November 11, 1657, some months after the commencement of the Second Protectorate, Francis, the youngest of the 4, was married to Robert Rich, the grandson of the Earl of Warwick, the Lord High Admiral of the Long Parliament, and in the following week her sister Mary was married to Lord Fauconberg. The first of these 2 marriages was long delayed by the Protector's doubts as to the character of the suitor, as well as by his dissatisfaction with the proposed settlement, Oliver's moral sense once more entwining itself with his practical decisions. It was said at the time that he valued the Fauconberg alliance more than that with the Warwick family, as winning over a royalist peer to his side. Not one of Oliver's 4 daughters ever gave their father cause for real anxiety. Though they were less strenuous than himself, and sometimes needed, in his judgment, to be spurred on to higher spiritual aims, he never seems to have addressed them otherwise than as those who were worthy of parental love. If he really preferred Lady Claypole to his other daughters, it was most likely because she was more sprightly and less outwardly pious than her sisters. Quote, "Your sister Claypole," he had written to Bridget soon after she had become Ireton's wife, "is, I trust in mercy, exercised with some perplexed thoughts. She sees her own vanity and carnal mind, bewailing it. She seeks after, as I hope also, what will satisfy, and thus to be a seeker is to be of the best sect next to a finder, and such an one shall every faithful humble seeker be at the end. Happy seeker, happy finder. Whoever tasted that the Lord is gracious without some sense of self, vanity, and badness? Whoever tasted that graciousness of his, and could go less in desire, less than pressing after full enjoyment?" Close quote. Of Bridget herself he writes with fuller assurance, quote, "Dear heart," he continues, "press on. Let no husband, let not anything cool thy affections after Christ. I hope he will be an occasion to inflame them. That which is best worthy of love in thy husband is that of the image of Christ he bears. Look on that and love it best, and all the rest for that. I pray for thee and him. Do so for me." Close quote. Yet even Bridget was far from answering to the modern conception of the Puritan lady, as is testified by the splendid yellow silk petticoat, which has been handed down from generation to generation in the family of her eldest daughter. Nevertheless, it was not Bridget's vanity which was most on her father's mind. 5 years later, in writing to his wife from Edinburgh, he begs her to, quote, "mind poor Betty," i.e. Elizabeth, Lady Claypole, "of the Lord's great mercy, and to urge her to take heed of a departing heart, and of being cozened with worldly vanities and worldly company, which I doubt she is too subject to." Close quote. The liveliness which caused such searchings of heart was doubtless the tie which bound more firmly Oliver's love to her. One day we hear of her demurely assuring Whitelocke that it was fear of his great influence which had caused her father to send him out of the way to Sweden when he was about to assume the Protectorate. At another time, we are told of her driving with her cousin Ingoldsby and 2 of her sisters, all the 3 ladies dressed in green, whilst the courtier-like crowd watch their movements and bow as they pass. Then we hear of the scornful language in which, with the pride of a lady by birth, as well as by her father's advancement, she accounted for the absence of the wives of some of the major generals from an entertainment at which she took part. Quote, "I warrant you they are washing their dishes at home, as they used to do." Close quote. Yet, withal, she had an open ear for trouble, and a ready tongue to plead not in vain the cause of the innocent with her father. By the summer of 1657 her health had been failing, and at one time her life had been despaired of. Oliver's own health was far from being such as to promise length of days. Though he had had no serious illness since the time when his life was in danger in Scotland after the toils and anxiety of the Dunbar campaign, short spells of ill health are frequently mentioned, and the Venetian ambassador, presented to him in the autumn of 1655, noticed the shaking hand with which he held his hat in welcoming him, a symptom of weakness which left its mark on his handwriting during the later period of his life. In the summer of 1657 he was detained at Hampton Court by illness, apparently of the character of a malarial fever, for more than a week. Yet his spirit was as high, his resolution as strong as ever. At no time had the state of public affairs made larger demands upon his mental powers than in the last 14 months of his life. It is true that the adoption of the new parliamentary constitution had appeared, for a moment, to have solved the problem of domestic government, but his sagacity would have been far less than it was if he had imagined that all his difficulties were at an end. If, on the other hand, the Protector looked abroad, fortune appeared to smile. Whilst Parliament was still in session, news arrived that Blake had destroyed the Spanish treasure fleet under the protection of forts in the harbor of Santa Cruz in Tenerife. It was the most hazardous and consequently the most glorious action of a noble and patriotic life. Worn out by toils and exposure, Blake sought and obtained leave to come home in search of the rest he so sorely needed. Before the vessel that bore him reached Plymouth, his spirit had passed away. The great admiral was honored with a public funeral in Westminster Abbey. Spain, with her supply of treasure from the Indies cut short, was incapacitated from serious warlike effort, and already the alliance was forged which was to force her into submission. Even before the victory was won at Santa Cruz, a treaty had been signed between Oliver and Louis XIV, arranging for a joint attack on the Spanish fortresses of Dunkirk, Mardyke, and Gravelines, the first two to fall to the share of England, and the last to that of France. An English force of 6,000 men was to be combined with a French force of 20,000, the blockade at sea being entrusted to an English fleet. Half the English contingent was at once dispatched under Sir John Reynolds, but either the necessities of war or the reluctance of Mazarin to carry out his engagements led him to prefer the distant siege of Montmedy to an attack on the coast towns, and it was only after a warm expostulation from the Protector that measures were taken to carry out the treaty. Of the quality of the English contingent there could be no doubt. Turenne, whose praise in military matters was praise indeed, declared that he had never seen finer troops. As soon as Mazarin was found to be in earnest, the remaining 3,000 men were dispatched to Flanders, and before the end of October, Mardyke was captured and loyally placed in the hands of an English garrison. Further than this, it was impossible to go at so advanced a season. In the summer of 1658, the combined armies defeated the Spaniards on the dunes, and Dunkirk itself was added to the possessions of England on the continent. The wisdom of a foreign policy which gave England a land frontier in Europe has been often discussed, and the conflict of argument has not yet died away. It is true that in later years this country has had forced on it the task of securing colonial possessions which, in some cases for thousands of miles, march with territories held by independent and possibly hostile states. There is, however, no comparison between an enormous territory, such as the Dominion of Canada, inhabited by an increasing and loyal population, and a fortified post, such as that of Dunkirk, the inhabitants of which were alien in race and religion from the English garrison which was to hold them down, especially as Dunkirk was a mere port on the edge of a continent held by great nations, two of which coveted its possession and would certainly leave no stone unturned to recover it. The only parallels in our history worth considering are the occupation of Calais in the Middle Ages and of Gibraltar in modern times. It is idle to speculate whether, if Dunkirk had not been surrendered amicably to France by Charles II, it would have undergone the fate of Calais. But it is not idle to remind ourselves that, whilst Gibraltar is occupied in order to keep the sea open, and has never been used as a threat to the independence of Spain, Dunkirk, as we know from Thurlow, to whom all the secrets of Oliver's mind were revealed, was occupied in the first place as a menace to the Dutch maritime power, and in the second place to enable England to interfere with effect against either France or Spain, whilst it was believed by Mazarin that Oliver's main object was to crush the growing power of France. These pretensions might be condemned or defended on abstract grounds, leaving out of account any particular circumstances or any particular time. What is absolutely certain is that such a policy, if it were to be successful, required not merely the prolongation of Oliver's life, but the continuation, and more than the continuation, of his military system, at a time when the English nation, it matters not whether with just cause, or from mere impatience of a taxation which it was well able to bear, was bitterly complaining of the heavy burdens imposed by the necessity of keeping up the existing army, Oliver was embarking on a foreign policy which would topple down with a crash unless that army were doubled, perhaps even trebled, to make head against the enemies it would arouse. It was a policy condemned in advance, if only by the desperate financial embarrassments which must follow in its train, when France was no longer bound to England by her need of help against Spain. The hostility of France might indeed be confronted by a government strong in the devotion of its people, and in the accumulated wealth of another half-century of commerce, strong, too, in an alliance with military powers based on the need of joining in resistance to a common danger. If Oliver had been granted those 20 more years of life, which enthusiastic worshippers hold necessary for the success of his schemes, it can hardly be doubted that a European coalition would have been formed against the Protector long before it was formed against Louis XIV. Such a danger, great as it was from the mere political claims of the Protector, was immensely increased by his attempt to inspire his foreign policy, hazardous enough in itself, with a moral and religious sentiment which found but little echo in England, and none whatever on the Continent. No doubt it was Oliver's highest glory that he aimed at something more satisfying than the material gain and the material power, which are often held to be the sufficing objects of a nation's endeavor, and his interference on behalf of the victims of Piedmontese cruelty has sunk as deeply into the memories of Englishmen as the massacre of Drogheda has sunk into the memories of Irishmen. It is to be hoped that no one whose opinion is worth having will ever reproach Oliver for having sought to use his strength in defense not only of the power and interests of his country, but also of her honor, an honor which consists not in a touchy resentment of slights, but mainly in her readiness to help in the higher service of mankind beyond her own borders as well as within them. Yet there is no effort requiring greater discretion, greater accuracy in ascertaining the relative importance of complex facts, greater knowledge of the temper of those who are likely to be affected by the action intended for the benefit of others. It was precisely in this direction that Oliver's mind was most defective. From the beginning of the Protectorate, he had overestimated the danger to Protestantism from the Roman Catholic powers, and had striven in vain to form a great Protestant alliance to resist what was scarcely more than an imaginary danger. The massacre of the Vaudois had confirmed his belief that the danger was a permanent one, and his war with Spain had brought him into sharp antagonism with a Roman Catholic power of intensest bigotry. We may therefore give full credence to Thurlow when he adds to the causes which induced Oliver to occupy Dunkirk his hope that the possession of the place would be serviceable to his great design of weakening not merely Spain, but the whole House of Austria, as being engaged in a conspiracy for the injury and, if possible, the destruction of Protestantism. That this view of the case was a gross anachronism, no one familiar with the history of Europe will now deny. Isolated instances indeed there were, and there were likely to be more, of the persecution of Protestants by Roman Catholic governments, but the tendency to form European alliances on the basis of religion was a thing of the past. So far, indeed, as Dunkirk was in question, and both critics and admirers of the foreign policy of the Protectorate have been apt to argue as if it concerned France and Spain alone, Oliver's intentions in this direction are of little interest, as he did not live long enough even to attempt to make his new port the basis of a European war. It is in his Baltic policy that the defects of his method were most clearly revealed. The policy of Sweden had long been directed to the acquisition of possessions on the opposite coast of the Baltic, a policy which Oliver had more recently followed on a smaller scale with regard to the lands beyond the Channel. With a territory more thinly populated and poorer than that of England, the kings of Sweden had, like the Commonwealth and Protectorate, gathered an army too large to be supported except by offensive war. The command of the Baltic Sea was the object in view, and in 1648, at the end of the 30 Years' War, Sweden found herself in possession not merely of Finland and the coast districts as far south as Riga, but of western Pomerania, of the port of Wismar, and of the secularized bishoprics of Bremen and Verden. It was a policy even more provocative than that pursued by Oliver, because it concerned not merely the possession of a solitary point beyond the sea, but the possession of territories commanding the mouths of such rivers as the Oder, flowing into the Baltic, and the Elbe and the Weser, flowing into the North Sea. In 1655, the warrior king, Charles X, who in the year before had succeeded to the Swedish throne upon the abdication of Christina, plunged into a war with Poland, which threatened to give him the command of the Vistula as well. In all this England had an interest, because it was of great importance to her that the whole trade of the Baltic, whence she derived the materials without which she would have been unable to send her fleets to sea, should not pass entirely into the hands of one great military power. It was this view of the case which commended itself to the Dutch, and led in 1656 to their sending a fleet into the Baltic to preserve the independence of Danzig. Such a view could not be lost sight of by Oliver, but it was not in his nature to content himself with the chase after purely material interests. Ever since the summer of 1655, when Charles X made overtures for his alliance, the Protector had been striving to give to it the character of a general Protestant league for the purpose of striking a blow at the German branch of the House of Austria. Oliver's whole scheme can only be described as the product of consummate ignorance. Ignorance in supposing that Charles X, aggressive, self-centered, and careless of everything but his own interests as a king and as a soldier, was another Gustavus Adolphus, or rather, another such disinterested enthusiast as Gustavus Adolphus appeared in the imagination of Englishmen. Ignorance, too, in fancying that either Austria and Poland on the one hand, or Brandenburg and Denmark on the other, were likely to govern their movements by religious rather than by political motives. The crisis came in 1657, the year in which Oliver was raised by Parliament to the constitutional Protectorate. Charles X, having secured a hold on the mouth of the Vistula by his occupation of western Prussia, had naturally become an object of suspicion to Frederick William of Brandenburg, the great Elector, as he was subsequently styled, who saw with displeasure the growing power of Sweden on the Baltic coast, and who was urged by every consideration of policy to secure for himself the strip of land which intervened between part of his own possessions and the sea. Frederick III of Denmark again, fearing the ultimate loss of his own territory beyond the Sound, took the opportunity of declaring against Charles, and both Brandenburg and Denmark, Protestant as they were, looked for the support of Leopold, who had just succeeded to the Austrian hereditary estates. Leopold, however, instead of hurrying to the assistance of these two states, was held back by purely political interests, and showed little inclination to assist them. Charles X took the opportunity, and led his army through Holstein into Schleswig and Jutland without difficulty, thus gaining possession of the whole of the continental states of the King of Denmark. The Swedish king had been ready to fool Oliver to the top of his bent. Though he had nothing of the spirit of the Crusader, he was quite prepared to gain what advantage he could out of Oliver's enthusiasm. Happily for England, he had rejected the Protector's proposal, made in the spring of 1657, to take over the secularized Archbishopric of Bremen as a security for a loan, the archbishopric being required by Oliver as a basis for an advance into Germany in an attack upon the German Catholic states, a project far more unwise than the occupation of the Flemish ports, and one which, if it had been carried into effect, would have left little room for Oliver's panegyrists to dwell upon the excellence of his foreign policy. For the remainder of the year, Charles was quite ready to discuss the Protestant alliance, if only he were not required to carry it into immediate action. No doubt he would be ready at some future time to attack Austria or any other country if there was anything to be gained by it. For the present, he was occupied with his quarrel with Denmark, and till that had been brought to a conclusion, there was nothing else to be done. It was at this moment that Oliver opened the second session of his second Parliament. Full of satisfaction with his own foreign policy, he was also full of grieved surprise at the misconduct of Frederick of Denmark and of Frederick William of Brandenburg, who, not without the good will of the Dutch Republic, had thrown themselves in the path of the new Gustavus Adolphus. Within a few days of the opening of the session, Oliver held up to Parliament a picture of papal Europe seeking, quote, "everywhere Protestants to devour," close quote. Quote, "What is there in all the parts of Europe," he asked at last, "but a consent, a cooperating, at this very time and season, to suppress everything that stands in the way of the popish powers?" Close quote. Quote, "I have," he added, "I thank God, considered, and I would beg you to consider a little with me, what the resistance is that is likely to be made to this mighty current, which seems to be coming from all parts upon all Protestants. Who is there that holdeth up his head to oppose this danger? A poor prince, indeed poor, but a man in his person as gallant, and truly I think I may say, as good as any these last ages have brought forth, and a man that hath adventured his all against the popish interest in Poland, and made his acquisition still good for the Protestant religion. He is now reduced into a corner, and what addeth to the grief of all, more grievous than all that hath been spoken of before, I wish it may not be too truly said, is that men of our religion forget this, and seek his ruin." Close quote. The cause of Charles X had become very dear to Oliver, and ought, he imagined, to be very dear to the English people. The, quote, "popish plot," close quote, against the Swedish king loomed largely in his eyes. Quote, "It is a design," he continued, "against your very being, this artifice and this complex design against the Protestant interest, wherein so many Protestants are not so right as were to be wished. If they can shut us out of the Baltic Sea," with Oliver, the consideration of material prosperity was never far distant from his spiritual enthusiasm, "and make themselves masters of that, where is your trade? Where are your materials to preserve your shipping? Where will you be able to challenge any right by sea, or justify yourselves against a foreign invasion of your own soil? Think upon it. This is the design. I believe if you will go and ask the poor mariner in his red cap and coat, as he passeth from ship to ship, you will hardly find in any ship but they will tell you this is designed against you. So obvious is it, by this and other things, that you are the object, and, in my conscience, I know not for what else, but because of the purity of the profession amongst you, who have not yet made it your trade to prefer your profit before your godliness, but reckon godliness the greater gain." Close quote. It was Oliver's head, not his heart, that was at fault. But a few days after these words were spoken, Charles X was tramping with his army over the ice of the Two Belts, in that marvelous march which landed him in Zealand, and compelled Frederick III to sign the Treaty of Roskilde, which abandoned to Sweden the Danish possessions to the east of the Sound. What, then, were Oliver's ambassadors doing when that treaty was negotiating? They were but arguing, as any Dutchman or Brandenburger might have argued, on behalf of the material interests of their own country. They favored Charles's wish to annex the Danish provinces beyond the Sound because it would leave the passage into the Baltic under the control of two powers instead of one. They opposed his wish to annex more than two provinces of Norway, in order that the monopoly of the timber trade might not fall into his hands. Of the Protestant alliance, not a word was spoken. For all that, the Protestant alliance had not passed out of Oliver's mind. Now that Denmark was crushed, Charles professed himself to be quite ready to attack Leopold of Austria, if only he were allowed to crush Brandenburg first. And in May an English ambassador was sent to Berlin to plead with the Elector of Brandenburg to join England and Sweden against Leopold, to whose support Frederick William was looking against an unprovoked attack from Charles. Happily for England, Frederick William refused to countenance this insane proposal, and in August Charles renewed his war against Denmark, with a fixed determination to bring the whole of the Scandinavian territory under his own sway, before he involved himself in those further complications in Germany, in which Oliver, supported by Mazarin, was anxious to involve him. Quote, "France," said the King of Sweden, "wants to limit me and prescribe the course I am to take, and England attempts to do the same, but I will put myself in a position to be independent of their orders." Close quote. His ministers spoke even more openly of their future plans. When Denmark and Norway had been annexed, and the Baltic brought under the undisputed control of Sweden, Courland and West Prussia must inevitably pass into their masters' hands. Then, with an army of 40,000 men, supported by a navy of 100 ships, the Swedish army would march through Germany into Italy, visit the Pope, and plunder Rome. Quote, "Their first thought is pillage," close quote, added the French ambassador, who reported these vaporings, perhaps not without exaggeration. Charles X was a great soldier, but he was by no means the oppressed saint of Oliver's imagination. There can be little doubt that the maintenance of a war in the heart of Germany, even with a Swedish ally, would have been far beyond Oliver's means. The occupation of the Flemish ports had taxed his resources to the uttermost. In the speech in which he had sung the high praises of the Swedish king, he had been obliged to plead the necessities of the army as a ground for his demand for fresh supplies. The pay of the army was far in arrear, and it was on the army that he depended to keep down hostile parties at home and to stave off a royalist attack from abroad. Nor was that army needed for purposes of mere defense. Picturing to himself the majority of the continental nations as actuated by a wild desire to assail England, he inferred that attack was the best defense. Quote, "You have counted yourselves happy," he said to Parliament, "in being environed with a great ditch from all the world beside. Truly you will not be able to keep your ditch, nor your shipping, unless you turn your ships and shipping into troops of horse and companies of foot, and fight to defend yourselves on terra firma." Close quote. End of section 13. Section 14 of Oliver Cromwell by Samuel Rawson Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Tombooker. Chapter 6. A Parliamentary Constitution. Part 3. This, then, was what Oliver's much lauded foreign policy had come to: more regiments, and even higher taxation than what the vast majority of Englishmen believed to be far too high already. A great continental war, with all its risks and burdens, was dangled before the eyes of a Parliament to which such an outlook had no attractions. That Parliament was no longer the body which had voted the new Constitution. Not only were there now two houses, but the composition of the older house had been significantly altered. The most determined supporters of the Protectorate had been withdrawn to occupy the benches of the new house, whilst the clause of the humble petition and advice, which prohibited the Protector from ever again excluding members duly elected from what had now become the House of Commons, opened its doors to his most determined enemies. The men who now found their way to their seats, such as Haslerigg and Scott, were opposed heart and soul to the whole system of the Protectorate, and longed for the re-establishment of parliamentary supremacy. Such men were the more dangerous because they were sufficiently versed in parliamentary tactics to know the advantage of a rallying cry which would bring the lukewarm to their side. The powers and attributes of the other house were ill-defined in the constitutional document to which it owed its birth, and it was easy to gain adherents by urging that it was not entitled either to the name or the privileges of the House of Lords of the monarchy. After some days of wrangling, the Protector resolved to put an end to the debates. It was hard, he complained, to have accepted a constitutional settlement on the invitation of that very Parliament, and then to have it brought into question. Quote, "I can say," he continued, "in the presence of God, in comparison with whom we are but like poor creeping ants upon the earth, I would have been glad to have lived under my woodside, to have kept a flock of sheep, rather than to have undertaken such a government as this. But undertaking it by the advice and petition of you, I did look that you who had offered it unto me should make it good." Close quote. Such language must appear to those who judge by the recorded words and actions of this Parliament to be without adequate justification. It is undeniable that the Constitution contained no definition of the powers of the new House, and if there had been no other than the ostensible question at issue, it would have been unreasonable in Oliver to hurry on a crisis before attempting, directly or indirectly, to suggest terms of compromise. As a matter of fact, this question of the other House was very far from covering the whole ground of debate. A petition to which thousands of signatures were appended was being circulated in the city, asking for a complete restitution of parliamentary supremacy and, no doubt to catch the support of a certain section of the army, for an enactment that no officer or soldier should be cashiered without the sentence of a court-martial. Oliver was perfectly right in holding that the attack on the other house was equivalent to an assault on the constitutional Protectorate. He had himself looked to that house as restoring to him, in another form, the powers which he had abandoned when he let fall the instrument. By keeping in his own hands the selection of its members, and providing that that house should have a veto on subsequent nominations, the principle of inheritance being totally excluded, he imagined that he had sufficiently provided for the future. His objects in so doing may be taken as those set forth by a writer who had ample means of gathering his intentions. Quote, "It was no small task for the Protector to find idoneous men for this place, because the future security of the honest interest seemed, under God, to be laid up in them, for by a moral generation, if they were well chosen at the first, they would propagate their own kind, when the single person could not, and the commons, who represented the nation, would not, having in them for the most part the spirit of those they represent, which hath little affinity with a respect for the cause of God." Close quote. It is easy to criticize such a principle from a modern point of view. Yet, if the morality of Oliver's political actions are ever to be judged fairly, it must never be forgotten that the right of an honest government to prevent the people from injuring themselves by outvoting the saner members of the community was, rather than any democratic or parliamentary theory, the predominant note of his career. It is this, at least, which explains his assent to the choice of the nominated Parliament, as well as his breach with the parliaments which he dismissed in 1655 and 1658. Such views could not but lead the Protector to a breach with his second Parliament as well. The men who were grumbling at the insolence of his new lords were, as he well knew, prepared to follow up their attack by another, more directly aimed at his own authority. The remainder of the Protector's speech is only intelligible on this supposition. Professing his intention to stand by the new Constitution, he accused his opponents of a design to subvert it. Quote, "These things," he asseverated, "lead to nothing else but to the playing of the King of Scots' game, if I may so call him, and I think myself bound before God to do what I can to prevent it. And if this be so, I do assign it to this cause, your not assenting to what you did invite me to by your petition and advice, as that which might prove the settlement of the nation. And if this be the end of your sitting, and this be your carriage, I think it is high time that an end be put to your sitting, and I do dissolve this Parliament, and let God be judge between you and me." Close quote. No man knew better than Oliver the weight of the blow that had fallen on him. His attempt to govern constitutionally with a parliamentary constitution had proved as impracticable as his attempt to govern constitutionally with a military constitution. For a whole week he shut himself up, meditating apart from his council on the means of repairing the disaster. Only once during the whole time did he even appear in his family circle. Then, after prolonged consultation with advisers gathered from far and near, he resolved to summon another Parliament to meet in that very spring. He at least would stand firmly by the Constitution to which he had sworn, and he could but hope that the nation would be equally loyal when the choice between ordered liberty and the unrestricted government of a single house was fairly set before the electors. It was the remedy applied afterwards by William III to a similar mischief, and not applied in vain. Unfortunately for Cromwell, the circumstances were not the same. It is unnecessary here to discuss the relative merits of written and unwritten constitutions on the one hand, or of a dominant Parliament and a dominant executive on the other. The one form of government or the other may be desirable in different nations or at different times. The one thing needful is that the institutions of a nation, whatever they be, shall be supported by the national sentiment. It was this that Oliver had never succeeded in evoking, because he had never appealed to it, and he was hardly likely to succeed in evoking it now. He could, for a time, but only for a time, rule England with an army. He could not rule it with a piece of paper. At no long distance, as he already saw, the unchecked supremacy of Parliament would bring back the Stuarts, because the traditional hold of the old monarchy upon the minds of men was the only power capable of keeping in check alike the tyranny of the army and the anarchy which could not but arise if contending parties were left to struggle for the mastery without fear of military intervention. Oliver's own power for good was growing feebler. Financial embarrassments gathered round him. The sailors and soldiers went unpaid, even though Bremen had not been occupied and no English army was struggling, it can hardly be doubted, towards certain defeat in the heart of Germany. The Parliament he contemplated never came into existence. Another great royalist plot took up for a time all the energies of the government. Oliver, with his usual clemency, contented himself with 2 executions, those of Dr. Hewitt and Sir Henry Slingsby, while 3 more victims expiated their share in a project for raising a tumult in London. Once again, affairs appeared to take a more favorable turn. The victory of the Dunes, in which the French army, aided by 6,000 English troops, overthrew the Spaniards, was won on June 4, whilst the surrender of Dunkirk on the 14th, together with the subsequent gains of the Allies in Flanders, put out of the question any landing of the exiled king in England with Spanish aid. The thought of bringing a new Parliament together might seem capable of realization under these happy auspices, and preparations were made for its meeting in November. Whether that Parliament, if ever it had met, would have supported the Protectorate more firmly than its predecessors is a question which can never be answered. All that can be said is that the radical elements of the situation remained unchanged. Oliver had been deeply saddened by his failure, and his anxious thoughts told on his already enfeebled health. Death had been busy in his family circle. Young Rich, the newly wedded husband of his daughter Frances, died in February. Footnote. Her second marriage with Sir John Russell took place after the Restoration. End footnote. On August 6, his best beloved daughter, Lady Claypole, passed away after a long and painful illness. Oliver's sorrowing vigils by her bedside broke down what remained to him of bodily endurance. Now and again, indeed, he was able to take the air, and on one of these occasions George Fox, coming to talk with him on the persecutions of the Friends, marked the changed expression of his face. Quote, "Before I came to him," noted Fox, "as he rode at the head of his life guard, I saw and felt a waft of death go forth against him, and when I came to him, he looked like a dead man." Close quote. On August 24, the Protector moved to Whitehall. The ague from which he suffered increased in violence. On Sunday, August 29, prayers were offered up in the churches for his recovery. The following day was the day of that great storm which fixed itself in the memory of that generation. The devil, said the Cavaliers, had come to fetch home the soul of the murderer and tyrant. Around the bedside of the dying potentate more friendly eyes were keeping watch. Quote, "The doctors," wrote Thurlow to Henry Cromwell far away in Ireland, "are yet hopeful that he may struggle through it, though their hopes are mingled with much fear." Close quote. 24 hours later, the hopeful signs were still dwelt on. Quote, "The Lord," wrote Fleetwood, "is pleased to give some little reviving this evening. After a few slumbering sleeps, his pulse is better." Close quote. Scriptural words of warning and comfort were constantly on the sick man's lips. Quote, "It is a fearful thing," he 3 times repeated, "to fall into the hands of the living God." Close quote. The anxious questioning was answered by his strong assurance of mercy. Quote, "Lord," he muttered as the evening drew in, "though I am a miserable and wretched creature, I am in covenant with thee through grace, and I will come to thee for thy people. Thou hast made me, though very unworthy, a mean instrument to do them some good and thee service, and many of them have set too high a value upon me, though others wish and would be glad of my death. Lord, however thou do dispose of me, continue and go on to do good for them. Give them consistency of judgment, one heart, and mutual love, and go on to deliver them, and with the work of reformation, and make the name of Christ glorious in the world. Teach those who look too much on thy instruments to depend more upon thyself. Pardon such as desire to trample upon the dust of a poor worm, for they are thy people too. And pardon the folly of this short prayer, even for Jesus Christ's sake, and give us a good night, if it be thy pleasure. Amen." Close quote. Before long, hope ceased to be possible. Oliver himself knew that his life was rapidly drawing to an end. Quote, "I would," he said, "be willing to be further serviceable to God and his people, but my work is done." Close quote. A few more prayers, a few more words, and on September 3, the anniversary of Dunbar and Worcester, as well as of the hopeful meeting of his first Parliament, the tried servant of God and of his country entered into the appointed rest from all his labors. The man, it is ever so with the noblest, was greater than his work. In his own heart lay the resolution to subordinate self to public ends, and to subordinate material to moral and spiritual objects of desire. His work was accomplished under the conditions to which all human effort is subject. He was limited by the defects which make imperfect the character and intellect even of the noblest and wisest of mankind. He was limited still more by the unwillingness of his contemporaries to mold themselves after his ideas. The blows that he had struck against the older system had their enduring effects. Few wished for the revival of the absolute kingship, of the absolute authority of a single House of Parliament, or of the Laudian system of governing the Church. In the early part of his career, Oliver was able to say with truth of his own position, quote, "No one rises so high as he who knows not whither he is going." Close quote. The living forces of England, forces making for the destruction of those barriers which he was himself breaking through, buoyed him up. As a strong and self-confident swimmer, he was carried onward by the flowing tide. In the latter portion of the Protector's career, it was far otherwise. His failure to establish a permanent government was not due merely to his deficiency in constructive imagination. It was due rather to two causes: the umbrage taken at his position as head of an army, whose interference in political affairs gave even more offense than the financial burdens it imposed on a people unaccustomed to regular taxation, and the reaction which set in against the spiritual claims of that Puritanism of which he had become the mouthpiece. The first cause of offense requires no further comment. As for the second, it is necessary to lay aside all sectarian preoccupations if ever a true historic judgment is to be formed. It was no reaction against the religious doctrines or ecclesiastical institutions upheld by the Protector that brought about the destruction of his system of government. It is in the highest degree unlikely that a revolution would ever have taken place merely to restore episcopacy or the Book of Common Prayer. So far as the reaction was not directed against militarism, it was directed against the introduction into the political world of what appeared to be too high a standard of morality, a reaction which struck specially upon Puritanism, but which would have struck with as much force upon any other form of religion which, like that upheld by Laud, called in the power of the state to enforce its claims. Nor is this all that can be said. Even though Oliver was in his own person no sour fanatic, as royalist pamphleteers after the Restoration falsely asserted, it is impossible to deny that he strove by acts of government to lead men into the paths of morality and religion beyond the limit which average human nature had fixed for itself. In dealing with foreign nations, his mistake on this head was more conspicuous, because he had far less knowledge of the conditions of efficient action abroad than he had at home. It may fairly be said that he knew less of Scotland than of England. less of Ireland than of Great Britain, and less of the continent than any one of the 3 nations over which he ruled. It has sometimes been said that Oliver made England respected in Europe. It would be more in accordance with truth to say that he made her feared. It is unnecessary here to pursue this subject further. The development of this theme is for the historian of England rather than for the biographer of the Protector. Oliver's claim to greatness can be tested by the undoubted fact that his character receives higher and wider appreciation as the centuries pass by. The limitations on his nature, the one-sidedness of his religious zeal, the mistakes of his policy, are thrust out of sight. The nobility of his motives, the strength of his character, and the breadth of his intellect force themselves on the minds of generations for which the objects for which he strove have been for the most part attained, though often in a different fashion from that which he placed before himself. Even those who refuse to waste a thought on his spiritual aims remember with gratitude his constancy of effort to make England great by land and sea, and it would be well for them also to be reminded of his no less constant efforts to make England worthy of greatness. Of the man himself, it is enough to repeat the words of one who knew him well. Quote, "His body was well compact and strong, his stature under 6 feet, I believe about 2 inches, his head so shaped as you might see it a storehouse and a shop both, of a vast treasury of natural parts, his temper exceeding fiery, as I have known, but the flame of it kept down, for the most part, or soon allayed with those moral endowments he had. He was naturally compassionate towards objects in distress, even to an effeminate measure. Though God had made him a heart wherein was left little room for any fear but what was due to himself, of which there was a large proportion, yet did he exceed in tenderness towards sufferers. A larger soul, I think, hath seldom dwelt in a house of clay." Close quote. End of section 14. End of Oliver Cromwell by Samuel Rawson Gardiner. Read by Tom Booker, Knoxville, Tennessee, March 29, 2025.